The dream of an education without or beyond frontiers that inspired the international school movement could be seen, I think, as prescient trend-setting for the global age, for the rise of the multinational company, for the dawn of distance-abolishing digital communication, and even for the unavoidable truth that problems such as climate change require a global response. The movement, which had its genesis here in Geneva, has grown in size and been the shaper of what many recognise to be the most exciting and durable idea of learning, the international baccalaureate programmes, which focus on breadth and depth, are value-driven and interdisciplinary, encourage both personal development and actions which go beyond narrow self-interest, and, to cap it all, offer the most portable examination qualifications. As recently as 2010, in the concluding paragraph of his book, What Works? Success in Stressful Times, Hamish McRae describes the IB thus: if in this ever more global world the most important form of capital is human capital, the IB is the most important common force shaping the ideas of the next generation of people who will help run the world. In the age of globalisation, the IB fulfills the role of the global examination, but, he continues, it has done much more than just create a curriculum and an exam. It has devised an approach to education that is broader, more humane, more rigorous, well, I suppose just better than any national education system in the world. So far, so good. What next? More of the same? In my short introduction this morning, I want to focus on human capital and propose 3 questions for us to muse on. Firstly, how will an approach to education born and bred in the West of the latter part of the 20th century need to adapt to a West that is diminished, not just in economic terms, but in respect of ideas and values? As China, India, and other emerging nations grow in strength, are there clashes in ideals that we will need to prepare for? In essence, are the purposes of education unchanged? And I'm hoping that Professors Martin Jakes and Sugata Mitra will provide us with some pointers. Secondly, in order to manage better their and their parents' expectations, do we understand as well as we need to our students' prospects in a rebalanced world economy? They've grown up with rapid change, with areas of work becoming obsolete, with shifting political and cultural norms. How has this shaped them? And what is the purpose of university in our globalised world? Is that purpose universally understood? And how might it change as the universities of the East evolve? It used to be about selecting the most able students and educating to the limits of their ability. Is it still, or is that too elitist? In an unequal world, we always knew that education was the key to social mobility, but providing equality of opportunity and expecting equality of outcome are not the same thing. In our arrangements, are we doing enough to foster a healthy competitiveness, let's say a collaborative competitiveness, and enough ambition amongst our students? It's not our job to find work for our students, but it is our role to furnish them as far as possible with the attributes that make them employable. What are they? Are they all there in the IB learner profile? I had a very sobering moment at the start of the Christmas holidays. I think it was the 22nd of December when I started my Christmas shopping, and I walked down Bond Street in London and I went into Mulberry, the shop. Just by the door, with her long auburn hair, was a former student of mine. Her job was to receive the umbrellas. It was London, it was raining. To receive the umbrellas and put them in the umbrella stand. "Hello," I said. She's about 25. "What are you doing?" She said, "It's a job in between jobs." "Ah," I said, "and what is it you wanted to do?" She said, I want to do fashion journalism, and I've even done a master's," she said. It was a bit of an important moment for me to think, what kind of advice had we been offering, that she was there at 25 after a significant investment on the part of her parents, gathering people's umbrellas. And for the first time in my life, in view of these examples, I've started to worry that the values that I've promulgated as a school teacher and leader might be out of date. I want you to tell me that it's not so, that we must still focus on developing young people who respect each other, who have a conscience, who question, who doubt, who learn to cope with doubt, who care about building a peaceful world. But I know that I have had the luxury of standing to pontificate throughout my career on a very old Western soapbox of plenty, of job security, of opportunity and comfort. And those self-fulfillment slogans about be the person you want to be, speak with your own voice, follow your dreams, you can have it all, even if it's not all at once, as long as you work hard. Are they beginning to sound a bit hollow? As someone who's been fortunate enough to be paid to do something I love, do I have the right to talk in this way? Are we educating for our students for their future or for our past in this age of globalisation? And although I continue to believe that man is ingenious and adaptable, I do find it unnerving. In the work that we did last year to define the benchmarks for excellence by which we would assess our success as schools, we felt perhaps that resilience was missing from the IB learner profile. And I mean hopeful but not cynical resilience, though we were not sure that its acquisition could be planned in the curriculum. And finally, what about our own human capital, our staff? If developing our students is above all dependent on having and developing a great team of staff and school leaders, if we consider ourselves in the international market for those teachers and leaders, how are our schools as employers of people adapting to Generation Y? In Culture Shock, Generation Y and Their Managers Around the World, which was published in November by the Ashridge Business School, research concluded that the graduate workforce in their late 20s and early 30s, the products of our education, come to the workplace with different skills. They're motivated by different things. They think differently about learning and professional development, and they approach their work relationships differently. The report tells us that with their focus on self, on peer orientation, rather than respect for hierarchy and a preference for a strong work-life balance, these graduates have little patience with a job and will leave quickly if they feel that it doesn't meet their own personal ideals. They want clear feedback to secure their advancement. And managers, according to the report, are finding some of this difficult. They think they want promotion before they're ready, that they're missing out on in-depth experience due to rapid job change, and they're not developing the skills, the soft skills, particularly in face-to-face behaviour and with respect to teamwork that they need to. So there is a clash, a generation clash, a new generation clash. And it seems to me that we must continue to focus on people management, on investing in our staff, and on strong and effective appraisal and mentoring programs, and on encouraging people to aspire to school leadership. Although I've talked in terms of the economy and employability and of the market as we think about globalisation, I want to assure you that my mind is still centred on my passion for an education which is vibrant, where every student will have moments of awe and wonder as he discovers his world and discovers himself, where the pedagogy is inspiring and the staff deeply concerned for their students' well-being, where the school climate is humanising and abundant in opportunity. For me, by the way, when we say international education, we should mean excellent education. An excellent education for every child, wherever they're being educated, should have an international perspective, and an international education should be excellent in all its forms. I'm going to now introduce our first speaker, Martin Jakes. He's a wonderful person, and he is an immensely gifted writer and someone whose research for his work, When China Rules the World, the End of the Western World and the Birth of the New Global Order, is simply remarkable. You've, I'm sure, read the introduction to him. You'll know that he's a columnist for The Guardian and The New Statesman, that he ran Marxism Today from 1977 to 1991, during which time he developed it phenomenally, and that he is the co-founder of the think tank Demos. Martin is quoted as saying, "We still insist, by and large, in thinking that we can understand China by simply drawing on Western experience, looking at it through Western eyes, using Western concepts. But if you want to know why we unerringly seem to get China wrong, this is the reason." Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Martin Jakes and have a very good day.
You know, China poses two big challenges for us, challenges that are unprecedented, okay? In the 200 years since the modern world was created with the beginning of the British Industrial Revolution, we've never, ever, ever seen anything like this. We've never lived through anything like this. What are those two challenges? The first is we've never seen a country of 1.3 billion people, 20% of the world's population, growing at around 10% a year for over 30 years. In 1980, China was 1/20th of the size of the American economy. Today, it is over half the size of the American economy, and it's projected that it will soon overtake the size of the American economy. And the second thing I want to talk about in a moment is China is different. China ain't going to be like the West. It's not a chip off the old Western bloc. So we're not just talking about an economic challenge, we're talking about a political, cultural, intellectual, moral, ethical transformation of the world at the same time. From a culture that we are in the West deeply ignorant about and unfamiliar with. Now let me start here, because the pace of China's rise has accelerated, of its relative rise. This chart here is, on the left-hand side axis, it puts all the Western economies at the end, just before the Western financial crisis, at zero. And you will see what's happened till the first part of 2011. Most Western economies, certainly most European economies especially, are actually smaller now than they were then. America is now slightly bigger than it was then. Now let me superimpose China. That's what's happened to Chinese growth over the same period. And you know what the most obvious result of this is? The most obvious result is that, you know, there were famous Goldman Sachs projections produced in 2007 suggesting that the Chinese economy would overtake the size of the American economy in 2027. Since the Western financial crisis, do you know what the new projection is? 2017, 2018. So here, this is a chart of the way in which, because this is a process, it's a longer term process of China overtaking the United States. So it's already overtaken in those where those figures are shaded with a green background: steel consumption, mobile phones, exports, fixed investment, manufacturing output, energy consumption, car sales, and patents granted to residents. China's already overtaken the United States. So, and then to be, it'll overtake from there with the blue lines. That's what still lies ahead, including the GDP figure for 2018. And the consequence of China's rise, I think, is this: that already it is a more important shaper, moulder of the global economy, of the process of globalisation, which has been such an important theme for us over the last 2 or 3 decades, than the United States. And its footprint has 3 particular characteristics, I think. First of all, China is a huge trader, massive trader. Look, the biggest reason on the importing side is that it's a poor country in resources, just like Japan, just like Korea. So to fuel its industrialization, pushing half the world's iron ore is consumed by China, or zinc, steel, cotton, all over 40% of global output. And the other side of Chinese trade, is its export capacity. Now, that is too small for any of you to read, so you're just going to have to trust me, aren't you? This is the countries, that sort of mucky green colour at the top, the khaki colour, that's Latin America. Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Colombia, Venezuela, Mexico. Then you've got the 2 blue countries, that's North America, United States and Canada. Then you have the pink countries, which are the European countries. Russia's in green, Pakistan and India in purple. This is to give you an idea of the global reach of this. South Africa, Nigeria, representing Africa, North Africa is the orange, and then the grey colours are East Asia, followed right at the end by Australia in green. Now, I'll tell you now, in 1992, that's not long ago, is it? I was younger then, that's true, but it's not long ago. In 1992, I would guess that probably China was not the biggest trading partner of any country in the world. I mean, if I look at the figures here, 0 point something or other for Brazil, United States 3.50, Europe 0 point something, 1 point something. Okay. Then you go to the next column, 9 years later, 2001, and you're just beginning to get liftoff, especially in East Asia, which of course you'd expect because it's China's own neighbourhood. So 4%, but Europe's still pathetic. America's beginning to rise. Then you go to 2010, and you get the most dramatic transformation. Brazil, 14% of its trade is now with China. It has overtaken its historic economic partner, the United States, which is only at 10%. That is in Latin America. That's nowhere near China. That's on the other side of the world. Likewise. So, look, this is the best way to put it. If I just read out to you now, in 2010, the countries for which China is the biggest trading partner: Brazil, Argentina, Chile, Venezuela, the United States, Russia, Pakistan, India, South Africa, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, I should add, and also Australia. Do you know Australia, which has long regarded itself to be, a good old Western economy, now sends 1/4 of its exports to China? Australia, as a result, quite frankly, can no longer be described as a Western economy. It is the only economy, Western country, called itself a Western country, that has not had a recession since 2008. Why? Because it's now essentially part of the Chinese sphere of economic influence. So what you have here is, within a very short space of time, dramatic transformation. Imagine in 10 years' time, how many countries around the world will count China as its biggest trading partner. The one exception to this, and it's a big problem for Europe is a poor performer with China. Poor performer economically and poor performer intellectually, I must say. You know, a home of ignorance when it comes to the question of China. Secondly, the rise of China as a financial power. I mean, I'll just give you this. Now, do you know that these two institutions, which you may not even have heard of, the China Development Bank and the China Export-Import Bank, in 2009 and 2010 lent more to the developing world than the World Bank. The World Bank, one of the two great institutions of the post-war American order. Oh dear. Well, it's not like a Formula One pit stop, this one, is it? Right, good. Okay, well, I'm restored to audibility. Now, the third thing I'll just mention, but I won't go into it, is the rise of the renminbi. I mean, the renminbi is now being used increasingly internationally in the payment of trade, and I think over the next decade it'll rival the dollar in its use in trade, and over the next 10 to 20 years the renminbi will replace the dollar as the dominant currency in the world. So what we're seeing here is an extraordinary historic change, and I want to illustrate this, maybe not with this one, maybe with this one. This is to try and capture how the world is changing, because you might think, well, we're sort of nearly there. We're halfway through the process. We're not. We're right at the beginning of the process still. So look, look at 1950. China was responsible for 4.6% of global output. A tiny fraction of global output. And the United States was responsible for 27.3%, and the EU was responsible for 27.1%. Well over half, pushing 60%, with Japan had 65% of global GDP, just those three countries, or EU as a union. Now look at the projections for 2030. China, responsible for 33.4% of global GDP, 1/3 of global GDP, greater than the United States has ever accounted for. And look at America in 2030, 15% of global GDP, half the share of China, and the EU will be 13.1%. Now, you can look at it another way, by the way. This is actually a return to the historical norm. It's not that the last 200 years of history are the norm. It is that the last 200 years of history have been most unusual in seeing Europe and a European creation, the United States, as being so dominant. Because look, go back to 1820. The Chinese share of global GDP was 33%, was 1/3. And historically, for many, many centuries, that had been the situation. So to summarize, this is the world we're moving into. The decline, as Vicky said, of the developed world. North America, EU, Japan. 33% of global GDP estimated for 2030. This compares, for example, with around 2/3 in the mid-1970s. And the South responsible, the developing world, including China, responsible for 67%. Or, to summarise, these are the shares of global GDP in 2030, only 18 years down the road. Other, 2%. Japan, 3%. Russia, 3%. Brazil, 5%. Other Asian developing countries, Indonesia, Malaysia, so on, Philippines, 6%. EU, 13%. United States, 15%. India, 19%. China, 34%. I think you will agree this is going, our children and their children are going to grow up in a world which would be entirely unfamiliar to ourselves or our parents or our grandparents. This is an extraordinary historical change. Now, I must say as well, this is a great change. It's going to be uncomfortable for us, but how can we not embrace this change? For 200 years, the world has been dominated by a sliver of humanity. By a sliver of humanity, Europe, North America, the rich world, only represented 15, at the most, just under 20% of the global population. The rest of the world, the West and the other, the West and the rest, is often rather humiliatingly described, home to 80 to 85% of the world's population, existed on the margins of the global economy, on the margins of global discourse, was not really represented or enfranchised in any serious way. And then the world began to change in the middle of the 20th century with the process of decolonization and then the process of modernization, to the point where now the greatest, I think, I would argue, the greatest revolution of the last 200 years is the enfranchisement of the great majority of the human race. If you like, creating much more in a very rough and ready way, if you like, of a level playing field for the human race. And we cannot surely be, as humanitarians, be resistant or negative towards this phenomenon, difficult as it is going to be for those like ourselves who've been so used to being in a very privileged situation. Now, that's the sort of economic side of things. Let me talk a little bit now about the political or cultural side of things. It's long been assumed in the West that modernity is singular, that there's one type of modernity, it's a Western-style modernity, and everyone else, as a consequence of the process of modernization, will Westernize. If you like, we're all on the escalator, but we're at different steps in the escalator, but we're all headed for the same direction. And that direction ultimately is to be a Western-style society. This is an illusion. This is profoundly mistaken. Modernization doesn't just come in one size, in one shape. Modernization is not just a product of technology, competition, markets. It is also equally a product of history and of culture. There won't be one modernity, there will be many modernities. The reason why until the middle of the 20th century there was only one basic type of Western-style modernity, if you put Japan on one side, was because the other countries were not modernized. But the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century, that is the great change of our time. It is this process of modernization. And as a consequence, we are witnessing around the world, above all in East Asia, the creation of many new modernities. They're not completely different from Western modernity. They share certain kind of characteristics, but they also have, at the same time, very different characteristics. And that is sure going to be the case with China. Because China comes from an entirely different set of cultural and historical parameters to the West. China's never been Western. It is not Western. and it's never going to be Western. So if we think we can make sense of China and understand China through our own concepts, our own history, our own ideas, we are profoundly mistaken. That is why, to be quite frank about it, we make such little sense of China. That is why our predictions about what's going to happen to China, our constant belief that their transformation is unsustainable, has been unerringly wrong. Now, what I want to do now is to give you some building blocks. I mean, there's so many I could give you, but for time reasons, I'm going to give 4 building blocks to try and introduce the idea of what China is like, how China is different, how China will stay different, how China has been shaped historically. The first is this. China, it's true, calls itself a nation state. But it's only called itself a nation state for that grand European creation. It's only called itself a nation state for roughly 100 years, a bit over 100 years. But anyone who knows anything about China knows it's hugely older than this. I mean, the Chinese like to say, we are a product of 5,000 years of civilization. Well, you can stretch it that way, but you can certainly put it like this. 2,000 years ago, 221 BC, the end of the Warring State period, the victory of the Qin dynasty, and that was the shape of China at the end of that, at the beginning of that period. It was the beginning of the process of the unification of China. China's present-day borders, take that lower southern line on the top. Those are China's borders today. Go to the next dynasty, the Han dynasty, and you'll see quite remarkably that actually the borders of the Han coincide very strongly with central and eastern China today, where then as now the vast majority of Chinese live. And the important point here is this, that the Chinese sense of who they are, of what China is, of what it means to be Chinese, of the Chinese identity, is a function not of the last 100 years of being a nation state and having a national identity. It is a function above all and overwhelmingly of the civilizational history of China, what I call China as a civilization state. Confucian values, very unusual relationship between the state and society, very unusual conception of the state, as you will see shortly. Very unusual conception of the family and the relationship of the family to society. Customs like ancestral worship, social relationships like guanxi, Chinese food, Chinese medicine. You cannot understand any of these things in the last 100 years. These are very, very old products of Chinese history. Or, to put it another way, I like to think of China as a country constituted on the basis of civilization. Whereas I think of Western countries, especially or solely the United States, largely in the case of European countries, as countries constituted on the basis of nation. So I would argue that China is primarily not a nation state. It's only secondarily a nation state. Primarily, it's a civilization state. A civilization state, one, because of this extraordinary historical longevity. Two, because it so happens, and it's not always by any means the case with civilizational histories, civilization largely coincides with polity, with the borders. And the third factor is China's extraordinary size. Those 4 provinces between them have a population larger than that of the United States. Those 9 provinces coloured blue and green each have a population as large or larger than that of France or the UK. Extraordinary diversity. I mean, this is economic. You know, Shanghai, the richest province, Gansu, one of the poorer ones. But it's not just about economics, it's about politics, it's about culture. I mean, the extraordinary thing about China is that it remains, and I haven't got time to go into this, it was an empire. And 2,000 years later, where all the other empires have disappeared, China has not disappeared. China has stayed together. And China isn't going to disappear, and it's not going to break up. It's to do with the notion of ethnicity and the way in which the Han were created and so on, but I have not got time to go into that here. So those are the reasons why I like to think of China as a civilization state. Now, what does it mean? Again, not a lot of time to talk about this really, but I just want to mention one thing about China. You know, what is the great difference between China and Europe? Well, I would argue that the great... Oh, dear. The great difference, I would argue, between China and Europe is this. 2,000 years ago, Europe was a united entity with the Holy Roman Empire. And then the next 2,000 years saw the breakup of Europe into many different territories and ultimately into the nation states which comprise it today. The default mode of Europe is not a united Europe, as we all know so well, but it is this division into many different nation states. What happened to China? China, over almost exactly the same historical period, went in exactly the opposite direction. It went from being divided in the Warring State period to countless different territories. It began the process of unification in 221 BC. It had largely achieved much of that unification, certainly of the central and eastern part of China, over 2 millennia ago. And ever since, through thick and thin, through great difficulties, it stayed together. The default mode of China is the unity of China. So what is the most important political value for the Chinese? All Chinese. I'm not talking about government, I'm talking about all Chinese. The most important political value for the Chinese is unity. They know it's fragile. They know it's very difficult. They know the centrifugal forces are very powerful. So they are deeply aware of the importance of unity, and some of the worst periods of Chinese history have been associated with when that unity began to break down. And with unity goes the notion of order, and with order goes the notion of political stability. This is a mantra, if you like, for the Chinese, the importance of these things. So, that's what I want to say about China being a civilization state. I just add this. Imagine 2030. No, don't imagine 2030. Imagine 2100. Imagine in a century's time. China's overwhelmingly the most powerful country in the world. And you have India and many other countries which we're relatively unfamiliar with now, being extremely important in the global economy. What is it going to look like to have a civilization state at the center of the global polity? Well, I would suggest to you that what will happen is the nation state as an entity, as a notion, as a concept will continue, but it will be increasingly diminished alongside the rise of other countries and other cultures for whom the nation state was never a natural entity, because it was something they were obliged to adopt in an era of European and then Western domination. So when I was in India in July and I was talking about these things, India is very different from China. You can't describe it as a civilization state in the same way. But civilizational influences are very important in India. And when I was talking about civilization state, they were fascinated by this. And it made a great deal of sense to them. And when I was reported in the papers and so on, often the rise of the civilization state was one of the headlines that was used. That's never happened to me ever in the West, because the West don't understand it. Because the idea of a civilization state and these ways of thinking are alien to us in the West, because it has not been part of our history. Okay, civilization state finished. The second point. What is China going to be like as a global power? This is a very, very important question. And I want to suggest to you that it's going to be very different from the United States. And it's not necessarily all bad. Indeed, in some ways, it might be an improvement in some respects. You know, I'm fascinated when journalists write about China and Africa. They often say China and Africa, the new colonialism. Shows you how ignorant we are, doesn't it? Shows you how ignorant we are. Because actually China never had an overseas empire. It never had overseas colonies. It never colonized outside. What it did do is it expanded westwards, especially from the mid-17th century for the next century. And that's how China, one of the key modes of expansion of China. But it never, ever conquered overseas. It could have done. It could have done. In the Ming Dynasty, for example, in the 15th century, the great voyages of Zheng He in ships, which the West Europe had nothing like to compare with. He sailed across the East China Sea, the South China Sea, across the Indian Ocean. He reached East Africa in ships which were many times the size of Columbus's, and they never colonized anyone. Why didn't they colonize anyone? Because the Chinese way of thinking was different from the European way of thinking. The European way of thinking, both had a sense of universalism. Europe thought it was a universal model for the world. China also, in certain respects, thought of itself as a model for the world. But the way they interpreted that idea of universalism was completely different. For Europeans, they thought projecting their power was reaching out to other parts of the world, taking their military power, their political ideas, their educational ideas, their knowledge and so on, and their Christianity, and essentially, ruling these other territories. Ruling, I mean, that's exactly how it worked. You know, it was by political and military influence and imposition of power. Now, the Chinese didn't think like that. The Chinese notion of universalism was not like that. Why? Because the Chinese idea of why they were universal was, well, what is universal is the Middle Kingdom. Literally, we are the center, the land under heaven. We are the center of the earth. So the apogee of human achievement was represented by the Middle Kingdom. So why would the Chinese want to leave the Middle Kingdom if this was, if you like, the land under heaven? To step outside the Middle Kingdom was to step outside civilization into darkening shades of barbarianism. So the Chinese had no desire to colonize because there was no point in it, because it could only undermine what they were, what they represented. So their notion of universalism, of the Chinese notion of universalism, was completely different. That is why there was no tradition in Chinese history of them expanding politically and militarily in their own neighborhood or around the world. It's true they did have they did have their own system because they were dominant in East Asia. They did have a way of an order. It was called the tributary system, but it didn't involve. And most of the countries in Eastern Asia over many thousands of years were part of the tributary system. But it did not involve Chinese rule. It was based on really cultural, particularly cultural power and some economic power through access to the Chinese market and so on. So there's another reason that you won't find, I think, China throwing its weight around the world like America did or like Europe has. And that reason is because if you are governing a country geographically the size of China and demographically the size of China, this is an extremely difficult thing to do. Because this, as I mentioned, the centrifugal forces in China are so strong. So when Hu Jintao or Xi Jinping is thinking, sits down in the morning and he's got a list of things to do, the first 19 will be to do with China. This province, this problem, that problem, whatever it is. And only at the bottom of the agenda will be the world. Did you know that the guy who's been in charge of Chinese foreign policy, Dai Bingguo, who I happen to know quite well, Dai Bingguo was not a member of the Standing Committee of the party. He wasn't even a member of the Politburo of the party. So, old traditions there's still a good deal of continuity in the way China sees things. So, therefore, I think the idea that China as a global power is going to behave like the United States or like Britain and France and etc. beforehand is very unlikely. It's very unlikely. The mode of power, the mode of expression of Western power was essentially military and political. I don't think that will be the case in the same way for China. I think the way the Chinese will express their power is primarily, one, economically. You saw the trade footprint. Now imagine that in 50 years' time. And secondly, cultural. I mean, I haven't got time to talk about it. But for the Chinese, above all, what matters to them, what makes them so proud, what makes them feel superior often, is their sense of cultural achievement. They think they are the heirs to the greatest civilization there's ever been. And, one can understand that kind of way of reasoning. Okay, so that's my second point. My third point takes me a little bit closer to education. It's about the Chinese family. Now, the Chinese family is an extremely important institution. It's much more important than it is in any European society, including traditions like Italy. You can see this reflected, by the way, in the way Chinese write their names. You're probably familiar with the fact that the Chinese always put their surname first, unless they're in Hong Kong and so on, where they've been heavily westernized, but they put their surname first and their given name second. So Xi Jinping, his family name is Xi, Mr. Xi. Hu Jintao, his family name is Mr. Hu. Mao Zedong, his family name is Mao. And this is a very old Chinese tradition, and it signifies the importance of the family. Incidentally, another interesting facet of this is that there aren't, relatively speaking, given the size of the population, there aren't many Chinese family names. I mean, a few hundred. And so a name like Wong, or I think the most common of all is Li, there will be countless Chinese with this family name. Because the Chinese also think not only of their family name, but also in kinship terms. And one of the very common feature in China is Chinese like to trace themselves back to the mythical figure, the mythical founder of China, the Yellow Emperor, 5,000 years ago. And so they have all these genealogical trees and so on. Now, the family is a really powerful institution in China. When marriage takes place, essentially it's not a union of two individuals, it's a union of two families. And this, of course, is not unique to China. It's true in many other countries in East Asia, and it's true in a different way in India, in South Asia. The family is expected to take care of the grandparents, both by custom and by legislation. So if your aged parents, they're not left, by and large, they're not left on the to their own devices, as happens in Western societies or European societies. They have responsibility of care. Parental authority towards children in China is very powerful. It's a very different culture in that respect to European culture or Western culture. Whereas our authority as parents has become increasingly relativized and negotiable, that's not true in China. The will of the family, the view and will of the parent is decisive in the relationship with the children. And the way children are brought up is very distinctively different, I think, from the European experience. The Chinese tradition is very ethical, very moral. It stems back at least to Confucius, and the idea that there's a clear difference between right and wrong. These are not grey areas. The Chinese bring their children up thinking there's a right way of doing things and a wrong way of doing things, a right way of behaving and a wrong way of behaving. And the parents have a very strong expectation and requirement of their children, which borders very closely on what I'm going to say about education. And the other thing I want to mention is this, that China is a shame-based culture, like Japan and like various other countries, and not a guilt-based culture. Western societies are based on guilt, the belief that we naturally err in our behavior and we seek salvation, and Jesus Christ was brought onto the earth in order to save us from our own sins. So we pray for our own redemption, or we confess, and so on. This is very much part of the way, even as religions decline, this is still very much part of the sort of, if you like, intellectual universe of Western societies. Now, the Chinese system is very, very different. The Chinese system is a shame-based culture. Children learn their place in society through the family. That is where they learn what their rights and what their obligations are. The Chinese have a very optimistic view of human nature, unlike ourselves. We have a very pessimistic view that we're always about to sin. The Chinese have a very optimistic view that essentially, as Mencius, one of Confucius's followers, later argued, that there's that brought up in the right way in terms of both parenting and education, Chinese children, there's no reason why Chinese people, individuals, cannot be virtuous and good. But they have to be brought up in the right way. So the sense of discipline in Chinese society, unlike in Western society, which comes from an external religious code, historically, in China it comes from within the family. Within the family. That's where they learn their rights, obligations, and self-discipline. And I think one of the most interesting expressions of this is behavior of East Asian kids and Western kids. I mean, I am often embarrassed by the behavior of Western kids abroad, teenagers and so on. Throwing their weight around, loud, not observing the customs of the society, not respecting the customs of that society. Well, you can say part of it was a result of the imperial tradition, and we learnt to think of ourselves as superior, and we still carry in some way or other that tradition downward. I'm afraid there's still quite a bit of truth in that, in my view. But also, it's because in the Chinese family, or the Japanese family, or the Korean family, or the Vietnamese family, they learn a strong sense of self-discipline. So if you go into Chinese cities or Japanese cities or what have you, you won't see the kind of behavior that is so common in Western cities. And this is not an accident. It's not a function simply of levels of development. It's a function of a different culture. Right, this brings me to my fourth point, which is about politics. The Chinese have a very different view of politics and the state to the Western tradition. What's the Chinese view? Well, the Chinese view essentially recognizes that government is extremely important. I mean, it allocates and awards government absolutely central place in Chinese society. There are the two most important institutions for the Chinese are government and the family. And the two institutions are very closely related in the Chinese mind. So the consequence is that the Chinese government, Chinese state, there really never have been any boundaries to its authority. I mean, this isn't just true of the communist period. This is above all true in the imperial period. I mean, this stems very much from the Confucius. Confucius writing 2,500 years ago. For Confucius, he didn't believe in democracy. He believed that it was very important that government should be guided by the best thinkers and the best moral teaching, and so it had a highly ethical dimension, and if the people had a significant say in the way in which government worked in China, then it could only corrode and deteriorate the wisdom of the rulers. Now, there was incidentally, just to mention this, there was a democratic element that appeared, much more democratic than the European teaching of the time. And that was that if the emperor cocked things up and was making a mess of it, then the mandate of heaven, as it was described, could be deemed to be withdrawn. In other words, the people were in their rights to rise up against the emperor and overthrow him. This contrasts with the divine right of kings, which of course did not in any way allow that kind of response from the people. So it's just worthwhile adding that historical footnote. Now, we think in the West, the great Achilles heel of China is the state, is government, is the lack of legitimacy of the Chinese government. Because we know that legitimacy of government is a function overwhelmingly, even almost exclusively, of democracy. And the Chinese ain't got no democracy. So therefore, their state must be fragile. Well, I don't accept the argument that legitimacy of the authority of the state is simply a function of democracy. If it was, could anyone explain Italy? Because Italy has more elections than I've ever had hot dinners. And what's the chronic problem of Italian governance? Ever since the Risorgimento, it is the lack of legitimacy in the eyes of the Italian population of central government. So it can't be as simple as that. I'll give you another example. China. The Chinese state, I would argue, Chinese government enjoys greater legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese than any Western government. These are some figures put together by Tony Sage at Harvard. He's done a lot of opinion surveys and so on, and these figures are borne out also by the Pew Global Attitude Surveys. And this is levels of satisfaction with the Chinese government. And the blue line on the left is central government. And you'll see, over 80%, 80%, 90, nearly 90%, over 90%. So, why? Well, because actually, in the eyes of the Chinese, they see government differently. I mean, this is not just true of China, it's also true in other East Asian countries, but it's particularly a characteristic of China. They see government in a different way. We see government in a utilitarian and instrumentalist way. They don't see it. For the Chinese, the government is modelled on the family. I mean, Confucius was quite clear about this. The model for the emperor's behaviour was that of a father. So in the Chinese government, Chinese state is seen by the Chinese as like the family, as the template for government is the family. And the family is not an instrumentalist or a utilitarian institution. That is not the way the family operates. So the whole way of thinking is very different. The most important, the reason I think why Chinese government enjoys this kind of legitimacy is because it has its highest duty of all is the defense of the unity of Chinese civilization. That is the most important task of Chinese government. And of course, we don't have an equivalent because we don't have that civilizational history in the way that the Chinese do. So if you want to understand the Chinese state and the attitude of the Chinese towards the state, think of the Chinese parent, as a Chinese lawyer once said to me. The way the state behaves in China is the way the Chinese parent behaves. Something like that. This is so different from the Western tradition, isn't it? So different. But we need to understand it. And we need to stop, every time we think about Chinese politics, say, no human rights. Where are the elections done? I'm not saying these things don't matter. I'm not saying they're not going to be important. But just to have that as our agenda to understand Chinese politics is a remarkable display of a lack of historical and cultural understanding. I think China will be steadily become more democratic, but it will never be like we are. Just like, the idea that Japan is a Western-style democracy because it's got elections and because it's got a multi-party system is a nonsense. These are add-ons to essentially a Shintoist system which is based historically on a Japanese variant of Confucianism. Now, well, there we are. You see, what I'm trying to do with my 4 building blocks for you is to give you some idea of what China is like, of how we must try and understand China. And this is such an important task for us. Because if we don't understand China, and China is going to be the dominant country in the world, how the hell are we going to survive and live and adapt and respond to a world where its culture, its history, its ideas will become more and more influential, and I would suggest to you, will become hegemonic over time. So we have to grasp this problem. Now, this is going to be very difficult for us. I think this is going to be really, really hard for us. Really, really hard. Because we have scratched it, all of us, each of us, including me, scratched away, and somehow we have a view that our ideas are universal, we are the most advanced societies, we have a sense of entitlement, we've been running the world for so long, you think about global institutions, people talk about international society. I don't know if it's true in Switzerland, but certainly in my own country, glibly referred on popular, serious current affairs programs to, the international community. They don't mean the international community; they mean the West. That's what they mean. They don't mean the globe, the global community. They mean the West. And we can't carry on like that. We assume that institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, will carry on running the world. I'm sorry, that's not going to happen. Either those institutions are going to be transformed by the rise of China and India and so on, where the centre of gravity of the global economy will reside, or they will disappear and they will be replaced by other kinds of institutions. We assume that the global currency is always a Western currency. It was the pound in the era of the gold standard. Today it's the dollar. It ain't going to be carrying on for that much longer. We assume the global interlocutor language is a Western language. We now assume it's English. I don't think we should assume that it'll always be English. In fact, I think it's most unlikely, historically, in the long run, that it will carry on being English. So we have got to respond to a very different kind of world, and we're going to find it very difficult. I love this quote from Paul Cohen. Paul Cohen is an sensitive American historian of Chinese history. And Cohen says, and he's right, I agree with him, he says, the West thinks of itself as the most cosmopolitan of cultures, when in fact, in many ways, it is the most parochial and provincial. Why? Because for 200 years, the West has been so powerful vis-a-vis the rest of the world in military and economic terms and so on, that one way or another, the West could always get its way. You can see this so clearly in the case of Iraq, and the way the West, and particularly the Americans, handled Iraq. What did they know about it? They were so ignorant about it. Their behavior was so ignorant when they occupied it. But that's a diversion. Let's talk about Iraq. Be self-disciplined, Martin. We could always get our own way. So we didn't really need... there are wonderful exceptions. There's a wonderful book by... I forgot. The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, about Japan, by... Ruth Benedict. Thank you. Wonderful book. Absolutely brilliant book. Object lesson in how to analyse another culture. She never went to Japan when she wrote the book. Incredible. Brilliant piece of writing. But these are rare. These are rare. In general, we've run the world without thinking we needed to understand other cultures. Meanwhile, all the other cultures around the world, which we think of as parochial and local and provincial, who don't understand the world, have actually been obliged by their own weakness and by the strength of the West to understand a culture which was entirely unfamiliar to them, namely ours. They were turned inside out by our influence, brutally in the case of colonialism one way or another, and more subtly during the sort of the age of America. So that is why Cohen argues the West is actually in many ways a highly parochial and provincial culture. Now, where does that leave us now? I suggest that leaves us profoundly ill-equipped to confront a world in which we will no longer be calling the shots, where our ideas no longer are predominant, where the paradigm is no longer our paradigm, it's a Chinese paradigm, where our ideas are being relativized and decentered by the rise of a very different culture, a very powerful culture, a very old culture, namely that of China. So I'm not too optimistic, to be frank with you, about our ability to respond to this. But this is the great challenge, and this brings me to this. You will remember, probably a lot of you, that at the end, I think it was December 2010, the OECD published its latest survey of educational performance of 15-year-olds on a global basis around the world. And the extraordinary result, which was top in the three categories, science, reading, and math, was Shanghai. Shanghai was the model for, was chosen as the exemplar of China. Of course, China's too big to have one, but anyway, that was it. You'll also be aware, perhaps, that by and large, it wasn't just Shanghai that did. I mean, Shanghai is remarkable; it's top in everything, and it was well clear of the other examples. But by and large, Confucian societies, Confucian influenced societies, did very well. The others were Singapore, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong. Hong Kong is a funny old example. Macau is also a very funny example. But basically, if you look at these figures, they're cracking results across the board, and the only sort of Western intruder really in the top table was Finland. Now the question is, why? Why did Shanghai do so well? Why are Chinese good at education? Why, if you go to America, are the top performing ethnic group in American schools Chinese Americans? Why, if you go to the UK, are the top performing ethnic group Chinese British? Why, if you go to Malaysia or countless countries around the world, do Chinese kids do very well? This suggests, isn't it? This suggests there's something cultural at work here. It's not a political phenomenon. It's a cultural phenomenon that's at work, that is part of a Chinese tradition. It's not just the education system, although that is very important, but it is also the attitude. Well, I've tried to list some of the points I think here that explain it. In Chinese history and Chinese culture, very high priority attaching to education. This is a very old tradition. It goes back at least to the 7th century. It goes back to the introduction of the Mandarin exams as a way in which the commoners could enter the imperial household. This is very, very, very advanced reform. For its time, the most advanced educational reform in the world, because it opened up education to those who were not privileged. The Chinese, great respect for teachers and scholars. I mean, even in the crass materialism that you find in China today, this is still very much a feature of China. There's a strong belief in China, amongst the Chinese, that education is the road to achievement. That is not true. In a lot of cultures, that's not true, including, I would suggest, in our own. It is not true. There's a notion that maybe you could become a footballer and earn pots of money, or you can get some shortcuts. You can go into the financial sector, and you used to be able to go into the financial sector, and make a hell of a lot of money. But in China, there is this tremendous belief that this is the way to success. So in Chinese family, it doesn't matter whether it's in the cities or in the countryside, there is this enormous priority attached by Chinese parents to the importance of education, to the importance of working. The Chinese kids work hard. Our kids do not, relatively speaking. They do not. Some do, but a lot don't, even in highly privileged schools. The Chinese attach a lot of importance to examinations. I mean, examinations are really, maybe there's a negative side to this, but they attach a great deal of importance to exams. And I just should add this. China is a highly competitive society. It's something I didn't really grasp. I'd say, why do you, to Chinese parents, why do you attach such importance to your kids' education and so on? And they say, we live in a very competitive society. And I say, well, what do you mean, a competitive society? Look, there are 1.3 billion people, they will say. So to make a mark in China is incredibly difficult. And the best way to do it is to ensure that your child has the best education that we can give them. And I thought that was very, very interesting. Also, by the way, the Chinese, unlike the European tradition and the American tradition, they value effort much more highly than innate ability. I think they're right. The Japanese are not dissimilar here. I mean, the whole Suzuki tradition on the violin is linked to this idea, actually, that we can all play an instrument. Whereas in Western tradition, the idea is, you've got to be gifted to be really good. But gifted? What do you mean, gifted? How do you know a kid's gifted until they've acquired the basic skills of whatever discipline or area of knowledge or artistic pursuit they're involved in? You don't know. Yeah, it's inconceivable. I mean, my son happens to be a terrific violinist, but I always think, he's 14, I always think, people say, oh, he's very gifted. And I think to myself, well, yeah, he is gifted. No, he's worked to get, when he started, he wasn't, everybody down, up, everybody down, up. He wasn't gifted. He was standing there with all the other kids. So it was being gifted in something isn't the work of a moment. It's not a sudden, eureka flash. It's something that only emerges over a long period of commitment and effort and sweat. Anyway, there we are. So this is what I want to say to you. We're moving into a world we don't understand. Can we respond? Can we adapt? First of all, you think it might not happen? Forget that idea. This is going to happen. Okay? This is not going, you're not going to have a dirty great big Chinese crisis in 2 years' time and this nightmare scenario disappears. Forget it. That's dreamland to think it's not going to happen. This is something extraordinary. Okay? Secondly, we can't stop it. There's nothing we can do to stop it. Some lunatic in America might idly think we can nuke them out of it. But that's not going to work. Why is it happening? To be quite frank, beyond the point we don't understand it. I mean, why did, at the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, China was at least as advanced as Northwest Europe, at least as advanced as Britain. The Yangtze Delta area was more prosperous in many ways than at the end of the 18th century, just before the Industrial Revolution, than Britain. But what happened? China never industrialized. Europe did. What was the consequence? China just ignored it, turned a blind eye to it, claimed it didn't need all that stuff, and what happened? China was screwed. China had an awful 19th century. This proud country was occupied by countless Western countries. The Opium Wars, you know, this was a terrible history. The Chinese call it the century of humiliation, 1850 to 1950, very understandably. And, you know, in 500 years, and we're still debating 200 years later why this happened. Why didn't China get its act together when it could have done, when it had such a great history? And why did Britain get it, you know, the other European countries, why did they get that together? Well, it's that kind of change, okay? That kind of change. We don't understand all the reasons for it, but it's not about, you know, Bush screwed up his economic policy, or Obama screwed it up, or it's bigger than that. This is bigger than that. This is one of those great historical secular changes. You know, no country, no culture remains on top forever. Nations rise, nations fall. Countries rise, countries fall. Civilizations rise, civilizations fall. It so happens it's our turn to decline. And that's the way we've got to understand this. This is the way we've got to grasp it. So what do we need to do? Well, let me be quite banal. I mean, you know, do you think our kids are going to survive in 2030 and the world after 2030 when the Chinese are responsible for 1/3 of global GDP without very large numbers of them being able to speak Mandarin? Do you really think that? We've expected, I'm speaking as a bloody Brit here, of course, you know, we've expected everyone to learn our language. Yeah? We have got to learn Chinese. Chinese has got to be a compulsory language in European schools. Fast. Not any old time, but fast. We've got to familiarise ourselves with Chinese culture. Not as a value judgment. I'm not arguing this is better than that. It's different. It's different. But we need to recognise it's different and understand it, because otherwise we can't respect it. And we need to understand it because we're going to have to learn about it. And there will be, just like in the era of the West, other countries had to learn what the West was good at and adapt a lot of those things. So I can assure you, the shoe's on the other foot now, and we are going to have to learn from them. We're going to have to learn about a history about which we are now extraordinarily ignorant, and we need to learn. And that is the note on which I'm going to finish. Look, here we have. Now, I've already given the game away with a remark earlier on. There's two boats, okay? Do you know what the big boat in the background is? Yeah, time. Zheng Hao, nice, okay, 10 out of 10. Zheng Hao's ship, one of a whole fleet that sailed on 7 great expeditions, as I mentioned earlier, across the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and across the Indian Ocean to Africa. And do you know what the little dinghy is at the front? Do you know? Come on, let's hear it. I like to hear it. It's so humiliating for us. What is it? Christopher Columbus. 80 years later, Christopher Columbus sailed on this sailing boat, allegedly to discover America. I don't know what Native Americans think of that. To discover America. Or look at this. This is a silk scroll done by Zhuzhou in, I think, 1367. And if you look carefully, wait a minute. There we are. What are they playing? You see, the Chinese even invented golf. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm happy to respond. I found much of what you said extremely interesting. But I have to say I found the tone of it rather sad. It seems to me that there is a massive danger in the West that we spend our time dealing with a kind of self-flagellation which rejoices in humiliation because Columbus's boat happens to be smaller than the Chinese ship. It seems to me that Columbus's achievement too was magnificent and to be celebrated with all the attendant human rights abuses which doubtless also existed with the Chinese ship. What I'm interested in is the fact that actually this is a huge opportunity. It's an opportunity for the West to learn more about a wonderful civilization, to engage with another global trading partner. And to me, the last 50 years teaches me one thing, which is the extraordinary adaptability. And that adaptability exists in the West as well as in China. Sure, there are some things we need to do in terms of fine-tuning of education. We do that less well currently than the Chinese, but the opportunity to learn from that is an opportunity which we should relish, something which we should prize. We do some things educationally better than they do in China. For example, the fact that you got responses to your questions yesterday. That would probably happen less readily within a Chinese context. If you look at the way in which global technology has developed over the last 50 years, the extraordinary changes we've had to make in terms of the way in which we work, and then project that in terms of the way in which we might need to adapt to a new economic situation. I prize our ability to do that in the West. I think we will manage to do so. I am optimistic, like the Chinese, about the way in which we'll handle that challenge. And I think it's a pity that we should have a negative message about this global change, which will be fascinating and interesting for all of us.
Well, I think I've got a lot of sympathy for what you say. I agree with you that it's a fantastic opportunity and so on, and we must embrace it, and this is the way we should go about it. But I think we have to understand the size of the task, and where I differ from you is I think there's a huge underestimation in the West of the challenge that faces us. That's my only difference.
Thank you, first of all, for a fascinating talk. I was very interested in what you said about China and colonization. Being Cameroonian, I've seen a lot of impact of China in my country. More and more buildings and in Cameroon. And I'm just wondering, if we say China doesn't want to colonize Africa, how would you qualify this very voluntary attitude in Africa that China has at the moment? These new partnerships, very strong partnerships established with Africa. How would you describe it? If it's not colonization, I don't think it is. What is it?
Yeah, it was a very good question. What is it? Well, it's not colonization, because colonization was a completely arbitrary process of conquest. And, you didn't negotiate with the locals, you just decided what you were going to do with those resources or what have you. So it's very different from the colonial experience. And I think the general African response to China's arrival over the last 10 years has been generally very positive and enthusiastic. And I think the reason for that is that two things. One, China's demand for raw materials has made a proper market for their commodities. I mean, when it was basically the West, there was a limited market. China's arrival has essentially boosted the prices of commodities, as we can see on a global basis, and this has, of course, been very much to the benefit of the African states. And the other thing is that the Chinese have adopted a more rounded attitude, haven't they? I mean, they understand infrastructure and the importance of infrastructure, probably because they're a developing country. China is the sort of past master, really, of infrastructure, and that certainly didn't happen as a result of, except at the edges, with the European colonial experience, or indeed even America's relationship with African countries. I mean, my word of warning about it, my word of concern, is this: that China is very strategic, relative to African countries and African governments. It's obviously a lot more powerful. And what will be extremely important, I think, is for African governments, one, to strike hard bargains with the Chinese, make sure that they get, that the nature of the agreements is in their interests as well as the Chinese interest. And secondly, to make sure that the rewards are now accruing as a result of this demand to African countries is used strategically for the development of their countries You know, I mean, one of the great problems we all know globally is resource-rich countries are subject to a lot of corruption often because of the nature of it, and don't develop a broader economic, a broader economy in the way that is really desirable. So, but that, at the end of the day, that really depends on, I think, the African countries and African leadership.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I don't have a question, but I have a comment. And coming from Asia, coming from India, having lived half of my life in the West, I could make those comparisons like a Venn diagram, but I just wanted to say that I was looking forward to you talking a bit about the role of women in the Chinese society, the role of gender distribution of work, because I think it's very important. And I was also looking at the whole idea of religious pluralism in the West and in many other countries, and also ethnic and racial pluralism. And, you know, comparing that pluralism to the kind of, you know, protectionist attitude of the Chinese society towards their race, their people, it's a very challenging and different parameter of comparison. So I was looking forward to you talking about how women are treated in that society, because you brought out the whole point of culture and values, family values, and so on and so forth. So I'd be interested to know a bit more about that sometime. Thank you.
I'm sorry to disappoint you on that. Gender is a very important question in China. There's a very strong patriarchal tradition. But I think mainly as a result of Mao and the 1949 revolution, Chinese women who were historically extremely subjugated, foot binding and the rest of it, have actually, despite all the limitations that still exist, have had opportunities that have not opened up in India in the same way, for example. For me, one of the most impressive things I find about young Chinese urban people, young people I meet, are the women, actually. You know, in so many occupations now, I'm dealing with young women, and they're well, like a lot of these Chinese young urban people, they're very, very professional and impressive about the way they go, about the way they go about their business and acquire knowledge. On ethnicity, I mean, but I don't write about this very much in my book either. But on ethnicity, the one thing I had to drop today, I'm afraid, I always talk about ethnicity in China. Except today I didn't, because I talked about the family instead because of education. But this is a really important question. It's about the way in which the Han identity has subsumed other identities in China. So the picture is very different, as you know, from India. And anyway, I have a chapter in my book on it called Middle Kingdom Mentality, and I share with you your view about the importance of this.
Ladies and gentlemen, we'll take one last question, and then we will have our coffee break. One last question.
Yes, with you we have learned a lot this morning about the history of China, but one should not forget about the history of the West, since the position of China in today's world is strikingly similar to the position of Prussia in the 1860s. And as far as learning Chinese is concerned, we better learn Tibetan, since we are soon going to be in the same situation.
You're very pessimistic.
Right.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Jakes.
Madame Christine Ocran, d'origine belge, elle est diplômée de l'Institut d'études politiques de Paris. Elle a également fait des études à l'Université de Cambridge. Je suis sûre que vous connaissez très bien son parcours exceptionnel dans les médias, en France surtout, mais ailleurs également. C'est la première femme à présenter régulièrement un journal télévisé de 20 heures en France. C'est son professionnalisme et sa détermination qui lui ont permis de s'imposer comme une figure majeure du paysage médiatique français. Et aujourd'hui, parmi beaucoup d'autres choses, sans doute, elle est journaliste également pour le Guardian newspaper en Angleterre. Je voudrais vous citer les titres de quelques-uns de ses ouvrages. Ces ouvrages, par exemple, L'Europe racontée à mon fils de Jules César Alluro, La double vie d'Hillary Clinton, Le livre noir de la condition féminine, Madame là, ces femmes qui nous gouvernent. Elle est également chevalier de la Légion d'honneur. Elle va nous adresser la parole au sujet d'une nouvelle éducation pour une nouvelle Europe. Je vous demande d'accueillir, s'il vous plaît, Madame Christine Ecolint. Bonjour.
Merci pour cette sympathique introduction. Merci surtout à vous, Vicky, et aussi à Conrad, de m'offrir ainsi l'occasion de m'exprimer devant vous. C'est très, très embarrassant pour une journaliste de parler d'éducation devant tellement de professeurs. Et c'est encore plus difficile de m'exprimer sur le sujet d'une nouvelle éducation dans une nouvelle Europe après cette extraordinaire description de l'asservissement qui nous attend sous l'empire des Han. Néanmoins, c'est une tâche donc titanesque, herculéenne, mais comme Titan et Hercule étaient après tout européens, je vais tenter de relever ce défi. J'ai été très frappée en explorant le site internet de l'école, de lire et de relire les principes fondateurs de cette école, qui, à mes yeux, expriment encore et toujours les valeurs mêmes de ce qui continue, à mon sens, de faire la force de l'Europe et la vigueur des valeurs que vous avez la tâche et la responsabilité d'enseigner aux jeunes générations. Néanmoins, une nouvelle éducation dans une nouvelle Europe, il faut quand même commencer par dire que l'Europe de l'éducation n'existe pas et que nous avons affaire à un système très différencié avec des résultats très inégaux. Bien sûr, il y a des principes communs. Dans cette Europe à 27, on a commencé à 6, et puis à 9, et puis à 12, et puis à 15. On a même accepté les Britanniques, qui se posent toutes sortes de questions. Nous aussi, d'ailleurs. Nous sommes maintenant 27. Il y a bien sûr des principes qui nous sont communs au long de cette histoire tellement fragmentée, comme on nous l'a rappelé tout à l'heure. Et ces principes font évidemment la richesse de cette Europe différenciée. Pour aller très vite, et vous savez tout ça mieux que moi, l'éducation, c'est véritablement, telle qu'on la comprend aujourd'hui, c'est véritablement démocratisé en même temps que la révolution industrielle, donc au cours des 2 derniers siècles. Et partout en Europe, à peu près, les mêmes phénomènes se sont développés. Le divorce, ou en tout cas la séparation entre les églises et l'école laïque, la féminisation, la démocratisation, tout cela s'est effectué avec évidemment des accélérations différentes, mais à peu près partout en Europe et à peu près en même temps. Pour autant, ce système reste très différencié et en consultant les différentes données dont on dispose, les plus complètes étant celles de l'OCDE, on se rend compte que dans cette Union européenne d'aujourd'hui, où, conformément aux traités successifs, chaque pays conserve la responsabilité de ses propres systèmes éducatifs et ses propres objectifs, d'un pays à l'autre, dans l'Europe d'aujourd'hui, l'âge de scolarisation n'est pas le même, la durée des cycles, la durée des cours, la pondération des différentes matières n'est pas la même, le pourcentage de la population dans l'enseignement secondaire varie énormément, même si en moyenne ça atteint à peu près dans nos pays 80%. On constate que l'Europe du Sud reste à la traîne, l'Italie, l'Espagne, le Portugal, même si d'une génération à l'autre, l'éducation secondaire progresse. Et on constate que la Pologne, par exemple, devient l'un des pays du peloton de tête, en même temps que la Suède et la Finlande, qui apparaît dans toutes les statistiques comme un pays d'excellence. La Suisse aussi est au-dessus de la France et de la Grande-Bretagne qui correspondent à la moyenne de l'Union. L'âge de scolarisation, 3 ans, 4 ans en Suisse, apparemment c'est plus tard, à peu près 15 ans d'études. Partout, aujourd'hui en Europe, il y a plus de filles dans le système de notre éducation secondaire que de garçons. Le résultat, soit dit en passant, tend à être un peu meilleur, et néanmoins, et on le verra tout à l'heure, les formations restent différentes. Partout, on vérifie que l'accès aux études supérieures devient plus élevé. Néanmoins, quand on regarde le niveau des dépenses publiques, toujours au sein de cette Europe des 27, on voit que le pourcentage du produit national brut consacré par l'Islande et le Danemark reste très élevé. Les plus bas, Italie, Hongrie, Tchéquie, Slovaquie. Et bizarrement, la Suisse. Là, je parle évidemment des dépenses publiques. Et donc, on a encore une fois cette idée d'une Europe extraordinairement fragmentée, où la part de financement public et privé varie d'un pays à l'autre, la part des salaires des enseignants dans les budgets de l'éducation varie aussi énormément. Là où le coût par élève est le plus élevé, c'est l'Autriche, j'ignorais, l'Espagne, le Portugal. On voit aussi que dans les rythmes scolaires, les pays scandinaves qui ont d'excellents résultats statistiques sont ceux où les élèves sont soumis au moins d'heures de cours. Les pays qui fléchissent, à commencer, j'ai le regret de le dire, par la France, ce sont aussi les pays où les élèves ont le plus d'heures de cours. Tout cela, dans cette Europe différenciée, amène à des résultats très inégaux. D'abord, selon les cycles. Il est amusant de constater que si on avait la liberté de former un enfant du nord au sud de l'Europe, on aurait envie de le mettre dans le cycle primaire en Finlande. Ensuite, on le transporterait aux Pays-Bas dans le cycle secondaire et quand même, les terminales en France. Mais quand vous vérifiez le critère de lecture, on constate que dans l'Europe d'aujourd'hui, il serait intéressant de connaître cette statistique en Chine, un quart des jeunes de moins de 15 ans ne font jamais qu'atteindre le niveau le plus bas de maîtrise de la lecture. Un quart. Et ça a été en choc en France, il y a une quinzaine de jours, de découvrir que d'après un classement qui s'appelle PIRLS, la France est en baisse et le niveau de lecture devient plus bas que la moyenne européenne. On voit évidemment le poids des différents schémas culturels et sociaux d'un pays à l'autre de l'Europe, et on se souvient bien sûr de cette formule sans doute apocryphe de Jean Monnet, qui aurait dit que si tout avait été à refaire, en gros pour lui pendant la guerre de 14, puisque c'est là où il a eu le génie de comprendre à quel point notre continent pouvait rassembler ses forces. Jean Monnet aurait dit, si tout était à refaire, je commencerais par la culture, et certains même lui font dire, je commencerai par l'éducation. Vous le saviez mieux que moi, pour le moment, au niveau de l'Union européenne, il y a une définition d'objectifs communs, il y a le fameux programme Erasmus pour un certain nombre d'étudiants, mais enfin qui reste, hélas, en demande constante de budget, il y a un partage relatif de bonnes pratiques, on s'achemine vers une reconnaissance mutuelle des diplômes, mais il y a encore beaucoup à faire. Donc nous voilà face à une Europe très différenciée avec des résultats très inégaux et qui néanmoins, et c'est mon deuxième point, comme on dirait en franglais, une Europe qui est confrontée à des défis accrus. Et encore, en réfléchissant à cette conférence, je n'avais pas pris entièrement la mesure du phénomène chinois. Le premier défi pour nous, en Europe, c'est évidemment la crise économique et la cruauté du chômage qui frappe les jeunes et qui pose tout le problème des formations telles qu'on a encore tendance en Europe à les concevoir pour une certaine élite de nos populations. En Europe aujourd'hui, les jeunes sont de plus en plus éduqués. Il y a un peu plus de 34% des jeunes Européens de 25 à 34 ans qui atteignent le niveau universitaire. Néanmoins, ces 34,2%, pour être précis, sont de moins en moins intégrés au marché de l'emploi. Le chômage des jeunes, moyenne de l'Union, c'est 22,8%. Le chômage dans son ensemble, toute catégorie de population confondue en Europe aujourd'hui, 11,8%. Et on peut véritablement parler, sauf ici, et particulièrement dans cette école, mais on peut parler en Europe aujourd'hui d'une génération sacrifiée. En Grèce, 57% des jeunes sont sans emploi. En Espagne, 54,2%. Portugal, Italie, 35,1%. France, 25,7%. Et d'après le Bureau international du travail où nous sommes, ce ne serait pas avant 2017 que les jeunes générations retrouveraient un accès fluide au marché du travail. Pourquoi et comment a-t-on atteint un niveau aussi préoccupant? D'abord parce que il y a eu, un peu partout dans nos pays, une véritable déconsidération d'un certain nombre de filières, à commencer par les métiers techniques, les métiers manuels, qui ont été très dévalorisés socialement, même certaines professions libérales ont été dévalorisées socialement. Et paradoxalement, la démocratisation des études supérieures, vous savez tout ça mieux que moi, s'est trouvée déconnectée progressivement du marché de l'emploi. En France, qui est le pays que je connais un peu, on voit par exemple, encore et toujours, une inflation au niveau des études de lettres, alors que bien évidemment, l'emploi dans ces filières est rare. Et je pense à une anecdote que nous racontait Vicky tout à l'heure, de l'une de ses élèves recevant les parapluies mouillés dans un magasin chic de Bond Street. Il y a néanmoins en Europe des pays plus pragmatiques où certaines recettes fonctionnent avec la formation professionnalisante. C'est l'Allemagne, l'Autriche, les Pays-Bas, le Danemark aussi, où en fait, en encourageant les jeunes dans des filières d'apprentissage, on leur facilite une meilleure transition vers le marché du travail. Mais il est évident qu'il s'agit là d'une orientation qui, dans certains pays plus rigides, plus archaïques dans leur manière de penser, une orientation qui paraît toujours comme étant dévalorisante pour certains jeunes. Le deuxième défi, me semble-t-il, pour l'Europe, c'est bien évidemment l'immigration et aussi l'émigration. L'immigration, on le voit bien, à quel point sur nos systèmes primaires et secondaires, le choc de l'immigration de première génération, mais aussi et surtout, et c'est beaucoup plus préoccupant encore, de la deuxième génération, nos systèmes scolaires ont beaucoup de mal à digérer ce choc-là. Et singulièrement, si l'on en revient au critère de base, qui est celui de la lecture. On voit que le rôle de la mère, et donc le niveau d'éducation de la mère, est beaucoup plus important encore que celui du père dans la manière dont les enfants peuvent acquérir la lecture. En Finlande, par exemple, qui est au sommet des classements juste derrière Shanghai, enfin 2-3 places en dessous, on voit qu'en Finlande, par exemple, la mère joue un rôle primordial, les enfants ont moins d'heures de cours, dans l'apprentissage de la lecture à la maison. En Allemagne, en revanche, ce n'est pas le cas. Un autre phénomène lié à l'immigration tient au lien entre scolarisation et sentiment d'appartenance. Et j'étais très frappée de voir qu'aux Pays-Bas, des études récentes prouvent que les enfants de deuxième génération d'immigrés éprouvent aujourd'hui, bien qu'étant scolarisés depuis la naissance dans le système néerlandais, ces enfants-là éprouvent un moindre sentiment d'appartenance à leur pays d'accueil que la première génération. Et donc, il y a une vraie interrogation sur la manière dont l'école apporte ou non cette espèce de creuset de valeurs qui est, en Europe même, me semble-t-il, encore et toujours, le socle indispensable. On voit que dans cette deuxième génération, c'est l'identité par la religion qui augmente. Ce que l'on voit aussi dans ces phénomènes immigration-émigration, c'est que les besoins de l'économie, au sens large, ne sont pas satisfaits par la manière dont nos systèmes éducatifs fonctionnent. Et je prendrai un exemple paradoxal, qui est celui de la Suisse. Il semblerait que la Suisse ne compte pas assez d'universitaires et que donc la Suisse a besoin d'immigrés pour des fonctions à haute valeur ajoutée dans des secteurs où on pensait que l'éducation suisse fournirait suffisamment de main-d'œuvre. C'est aussi le cas en France. Pour un certain nombre de formations à numerus clausus, s'il n'y a pas en France de médecins ou d'infirmières venus d'ailleurs, le système de santé publique est encore plus hoquetant qu'il ne le devient. Ce qui est intéressant par rapport à ce phénomène d'immigration, c'est aussi en Europe, dans l'Europe d'aujourd'hui, et singulièrement pour les jeunes générations, le phénomène d'émigration. D'abord, il y a un nomadisme éduqué. On va à Shanghai, il y a de jeunes Européens, et même quelques moins jeunes, qui ont compris la leçon de notre ami. Il y en a beaucoup. Ce sont des gens très bien formés, qui considèrent que le monde leur appartient, qu'ils ont avec eux une formation, des valeurs, une histoire qu'ils sont prêts à confronter à d'autres, et cela, on les trouve partout. On découvre aussi aujourd'hui, sous l'impact de la crise, une émigration professionnelle. Beaucoup d'Espagnols, de Grecs vont en Allemagne, beaucoup de Portugais vont en Angola, et on voit aussi qu'au niveau des études supérieures, en tout cas, les migrations intra-européennes sont tellement importantes que certains pays, comme la Belgique et l'Autriche, sont obligés d'instaurer des quotas, parce que les étudiants qui, en France, tentent de faire médecine ou médecine dentaire ou vétérinaire et se heurtent à ce problème de numerus clausus, etc., ils vont faire leurs études en Belgique ou en Autriche ou même en Roumanie, s'agissant des études de dentisterie. Donc il y a aujourd'hui, me semble-t-il, et c'est assez nouveau, cette mobilité en fonction des opportunités. Le troisième défi dans cette Europe fragmentée aux résultats inégaux, c'est le défi de l'équité. Et ça, je crois que c'est une notion qui est au cœur même de nos valeurs. Il y a une relation entre la durée de vie et le niveau d'éducation. Et il y a encore une différenciation dans l'Europe d'aujourd'hui à ce niveau-là. Et elle est plus forte, et ça, ce n'est pas une surprise, dans les pays anciennement communistes, en Tchéquie, en Estonie, en Hongrie, en Pologne. Vous voyez encore que les gens qui n'ont pas d'éducation secondaire vivent moins longtemps que les autres. Même phénomène au niveau de la participation électorale, là, c'est connu. Ce qui reste intéressant, c'est le différentiel garçon-fille. Les inégalités diminuent, mais au niveau des filières, vous le savez mieux que moi, les filles peuvent être meilleures en maths ou en sciences, et néanmoins, elles ne choisiront pas de devenir ingénieurs. Pourquoi ? Parce qu'il reste encore des schémas sociologiques, qui font que il y a des métiers d'hommes, et les métiers de femmes, c'est plutôt la santé publique. La France manque d'ingénieurs femmes, comme les Pays-Bas et bizarrement la Finlande. Et c'est toujours fascinant, me semble-t-il, de voir, encore une fois, dans des pays globalement riches, démocratiques, où les femmes ont acquis difficilement, mais ont acquis néanmoins une égalité relative de droits et de devoirs, pas de salaire, mais quand même, on voit que ces schémas, cette typologie des choix demeure. Le quatrième défi, toujours dans cette Europe, c'est évidemment celui de la mondialisation. Là, j'irai un peu plus vite parce que, encore une fois, ce sont des sujets que vous connaissez tous. La mobilité du marché du travail, l'accélération de la concurrence, la course aux compétences. La course aux compétences, il est frappant de voir aussi que est-ce une forme de snobisme de nouveaux riches ou un calcul différent sur les chances d'un enfant. On voit quand même beaucoup de Chinois aujourd'hui appartenant à ces nouvelles élites chinoises qui font tout pour entrer à Eton ou dans une grande université américaine. Les compétences sont encore en Europe, jusqu'à un certain point. Et pour les élites en tout cas, l'Europe reste, me semble-t-il, un pôle d'excellence et un pôle de valorisation. Néanmoins, et c'est ma troisième et dernière partie, ce qui frappe, me semble-t-il, dans cette Europe où le Schadenfreude est quand même très développé, où la crise frappe, encore une fois, les jeunes générations, on s'interroge beaucoup sur les nouveaux moyens dont on dispose et qui démultiplient à l'infini les possibilités en termes d'apprentissage des savoirs et d'enseignement. On découvre de nouveaux besoins, mais les interrogations restent les mêmes sur les principes d'une éducation. Que doivent-ils être dans ce monde globalisé ? Le premier point, évidemment, c'est la révolution technologique, les nouveaux outils d'apprentissage, le nouvel équilibre entre la fourniture d'informations et l'interaction avec les enseignants, le phénomène des cours en ligne. Vous connaissez tout ça mieux que moi. J'ai lu quelque part qu'une salle de cours virtuelle pourrait réunir bientôt 1,5 milliard de gens, dont beaucoup de Chinois, sûrement. Aux États-Unis, il y a 2 entreprises, enfin 2 start-up qui se sont lancées en 2 ans, Udacity et Coursera. Coursera, 2 millions d'étudiants en 6 mois. Alors le modèle économique reste à trouver, le problème des credits n'est toujours pas tout à fait réglé, mais il y a déjà une université allemande Je crois que c'est l'université de Fribourg qui accorde un crédit pour un cours en ligne fourni par Udacity. Évidemment, dans leur splendeur, Oxford et Cambridge ont décidé que ce n'était pas pour eux. Mais on voit bien qu'il y a là un bouleversement complet du phénomène même de mondialisation. Et je crois que c'est particulièrement fascinant s'agissant de la Chine, où le système d'apprentissage, et on l'a bien compris, de transmission du savoir reste non seulement familial, mais très hiérarchique. Et avec cette ouverture formidable des réseaux informatiques, électroniques, de plus en plus difficiles à contrôler, on le voit aussi en Chine, on voit bien qu'au niveau de l'éducation, il y a là une révolution dont on perçoit à peine les prémices. L'autre interrogation concerne les modes de comportement. Au niveau des neurosciences, des experts s'interrogent jusqu'à quel point ces jeunes, nos enfants, nos petits-enfants, qui déjà sur l'iPad font 36 trucs qu'on est incapable de faire, sauf après avoir lu 3 fois le mode d'emploi, qui en général est tellement mal traduit qu'on ne le comprend pas non plus. Est-ce que ces nouvelles technologies vont modifier les modes de pensée? Est-ce que c'en est fini? Et là aussi, quelle belle tradition européenne. Est-ce que c'en est fini du vagabondage, de la découverte par hasard, du serendipity? Est-ce que c'en est fini de « Ok, j'étudie telle chose, mais grâce à tel maître, grâce à telle lecture, je vais avoir une démarche latérale ». Est-ce qu'on va, nous aussi en Europe, à l'américaine, dirais-je, vers cette espèce de segmentation, cet approfondissement extraordinaire, mais en même temps, peut-être, appauvrissant. Et c'est là où on rejoint ce à quoi je faisais allusion tout à l'heure, qui sont bien évidemment une conception devenue utilitaire par la force des choses de l'éducation. Est-ce qu'il faut former des jeunes pour qu'ils trouvent un job? Est-ce que c'est à l'économie de dicter, et qui doit le faire, et dans quel délai, et sur quel cycle, les besoins d'un pays ou d'un ensemble économique, du marché unique, dans tel ou tel secteur? Est-ce qu'il faut encourager, au contraire, cet individualisme bourgeonnant et lui aussi préoccupant en Europe, qui fait que toutes sortes de jeunes gens mettent un sweatshirt à capuche et se prennent pour Mark Zuckerberg et se disent « je pars en Californie faire fortune ». Et on voit là aussi une forme de ségrégation sociale qui se recrée, qui n'est plus tellement une ségrégation par niveau de revenus, mais une ségrégation par niveau d'éducation, mais aussi par nomadisme, une ségrégation par ouverture au monde, qui est celle que l'on encourage, mais qui, en même temps, pose des problèmes au niveau du renouvellement de nos élites. Et je crois que c'est tout le problème en Europe de cette transmission d'un universalisme dont nous sommes porteurs, dont nous n'avons aucune raison d'avoir honte, dont nous devons au contraire, me semble-t-il, prolonger, entretenir la fierté, et en même temps les barrières culturelles qui perdurent au sein même de l'Europe et qui surtout s'aggravent dans le monde aujourd'hui. La discussion globale, c'est formidable, et sûrement sous l'impulsion, sous l'accélération des pays d'Asie. Est-ce que la technologie fait reculer les barrières culturelles? le Pakistan, Malala, les femmes assassinées pour une campagne de polio. Un exemple très intéressant, un lycée français, un lycée privé, le lycée Voltaire au Qatar. Vous savez que l'émir du Qatar est pris d'amour pour la France. On a donc installé, financé un lycée, Voltaire. Le directeur de ce lycée a été renvoyé, enfin, on lui a suggéré de partir, parce qu'il avait cru bon inclure dans le cursus un cours sur l'histoire du Moyen-Âge. Et les Qataris, le procureur général du Qatar, a décrété que ça n'existait pas le Moyen-Âge, puisque c'était, en gros, avant le Coran. Et donc, on voit, dans ce tout petit pays richissime, qui finance des musées, des équipes de foot, on voit à quel point les crispations restent, enfin, demeurent, et même pire, s'aggravent. Face à ces crispations, comment est-ce que notre modèle européen, notre identité européenne, cet héritage commun qui est le nôtre, qui est bien sûr, c'est un agglomérat, mais c'est notre richesse. Comment faire en sorte que cette richesse ne soit pas centrifuge? Comment faire en sorte que, dans la mondialisation, ce ne soit pas une source d'affaiblissement, ce ne soit pas un lieu de crispation nationaliste, comme on le voit dans la Hongrie d'aujourd'hui, où les cours d'histoire sont modifiés parce que M. Orban considère que, voilà, on ne glorifie pas assez l'identité magyare. Ça se passe dans l'Europe d'aujourd'hui, dans l'Union européenne. Et encore une fois, c'est toute cette notion d'européisme qui existe, me semble-t-il, et qui est entrechoquée par l'accélération de la mondialisation, l'accélération des technologies et les chocs, les contradictions entre les traditions, les intérêts, les populismes, les anxiétés et en même temps la nécessité de maintenir la vigueur de nos traditions et la vigueur de nos démocraties. Pour conclure, avant de tenter de répondre à quelques questions, je suis, moi, européenne, convaincue et je suis très frappée de voir à quel point la difficulté, me semble-t-il, dans l'Europe d'aujourd'hui est de dire qu'on est fier d'être ce que nous sommes. Alors bien sûr, nous sommes les héritiers de cultures que vous transmettez et qui sont des cultures de questionnement, des cultures d'interrogation, des cultures de mise en cause, de mise en doute. C'est l'inverse d'une démarche pyramidale. C'est une autre, ce n'est peut-être pas une sagesse, mais c'est une philosophie et c'est un humanisme. Et je crois que l'hommage qui doit être rendu, c'est l'hommage à vous rendre à vous. Parce que sans vous, dans cette Europe, et singulièrement ici à Genève, et singulièrement par rapport aux élèves que vous éduquez depuis si longtemps, si vous ne réussissez pas, ici à Genève, en Europe, en s'adressant à ces élèves qui, certes, ne sont pas les plus défavorisés, ne sont pas les plus mal lotis, mais si nous n'arrivons plus ensemble, si nous doutons ensemble de notre capacité à transmettre ce dont nous devons être fiers, alors là, il ne suffira pas seulement d'apprendre le chinois, et encore moins le tibétain. Merci.
Ici.
Oui, monsieur.
Oui, bonjour madame, très honoré de vous poser une question. Mon nom c'est Alexandre Anting, je suis enseignant à Genève dans le domaine technique. Ma question concernant la scolarisation et sentiment d'appartenance, indépendamment de toute forme de religion et paganisme. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez me dire à ce sujet?
La question est
Pour
vaste.
être clair, je ne veux pas qu'on se disperse sur la religion ou toute forme de paganisme, mais cette appartenance, que voulez-vous dire par là?
Appartenance, je crois que c'est très précisément l'apprentissage de valeurs communes, l'apprentissage de la civilité, l'apprentissage du choix, la liberté du choix, la nécessité d'éduquer le choix. Tout ce qui fait, me semble-t-il, la tradition européenne depuis le Moyen-Âge, puisqu'on en parlait.
D'accord, je veux mieux préciser ma question. S'agit-il pas de nouvelles formes, je dirais, pas de groupe, mais de mentalités liées au comportement éventuellement de la jeunesse ou toutes sortes de ce qui se passe en Europe, par exemple?
Enfin, je crois encore une fois que l'éducation, cela consiste à transmettre. Et par rapport à cela, il y a évidemment l'évolution des sociétés, etc., qui interagissent. Mais il me semble qu'il y a toujours un corpus de transmission du savoir, du comportement, d'un certain nombre de valeurs auxquelles il est important, qu'il est important de nourrir et qui tissent ce sentiment d'appartenance. Et ce sentiment d'appartenance est européen, quoi qu'on en pense.
Je précise, je vous pose cette question parce que je me lie à la question précédente concernant cette fille qui prenait les parapluies. Moi, je trouve que c'est une chose très bien. Cela veut dire que nous les enseignants des écoles techniques et professionnelles, nous transmettons un savoir qui n'est pas seulement lié au mouvement, hein, si j'ose dire ça comme ça, mais il est lié aussi aux questions comportementales. Cette fille n'a pas valorisé le fait qu'elle a un diplôme, mais elle a valorisé le fait qu'elle est capable de faire quelque chose. Et cela, je l'apprécie beaucoup. Parce que, en fait, chez nous, les gens sortent avec un certificat fédéral ou bien une maturité professionnelle. On les voit s'intégrer dans des professions qui sont beaucoup plus élevées et, à contrario, j'entends aussi que des gens qui ont des diplômes supérieurs peuvent se permettre de faire des tâches subalternes. Mais ça, ce n'est pas une fatalité. Hein.
Sûrement pas, c'est une question d'opportunité, mais il faut bien dire que la conjoncture actuelle, dans la plupart des pays d'Europe, n'est pas favorable à cette génération, quel que soit son niveau de diplôme.
Je vous remercie.
Oui ?
Bonjour et merci encore pour cette présentation très stimulante. Vous avez mentionné le fait que l'Europe de l'éducation n'existe pas aujourd'hui, ce qui est absolument inquiétant. Et je me demandais si, d'après vous, il existe une volonté d'arriver à une éducation, sinon européenne, en tout cas globale, à une éducation qui, par sa philosophie et ses objectifs pédagogiques, pourrait réunir l'Europe. Est-ce que c'est un rêve improbable ou est-ce que c'est quelque chose vers quoi on pourrait s'acheminer?
Je crois que, en fait, si vous voulez, les fondamentaux sont relativement semblables au sein de l'Europe. Mais la première barrière est la langue. J'étais très frappée d'entendre il y a 2 mois à peu près, Helmut Schmidt, l'ancien chancelier d'Allemagne, qui doit avoir, je crois, 92 ans, et on l'interrogeait sur l'identité européenne. Il dit, pouf, ça n'existe pas. La seule manière, dit-il, mais ça prendra 2 générations, donc c'est de rendre l'anglais obligatoire dès la maternelle dans tous les pays européens. Et à ce moment-là, dit-il, cette génération-là, ayant une langue commune qui n'exclurait pas sa langue d'origine, si j'ose dire, et toutes les richesses qui l'accompagnent, alors là, oui, il y aurait une identité européenne et partant un système d'éducation commun. Mais il y a des fondamentaux, me semble-t-il, qui sont extrêmement proches, mais qui restent très nationaux. Oui, monsieur ?
Oui, j'ai entendu tout à l'heure dans le précédent débat, conférence sur la Chine, le mot compétition. Ici, vous parlez de transmission, de savoir comme étant le modèle éducatif. Ce qui me pose question, et je pense que la question centrale, c'est comment on apprend. Et je pense que
ça, c'est
la verticalité, justement, la verticalité d'un apprentissage, quand on parle de transmission, et la manière dont on se comporte dans une société, les sociétés vis-à-vis des autres, me fait poser la question de savoir si le modèle d'apprentissage, de comment on apprend, de la qualité de l'interaction et de l'approche collaborative est pas là la clé un petit peu de tout ce qu'on vient d'entendre. À savoir que si on se développe en collaborant et si le lieu de la pensée et le lieu du savoir, c'est l'interaction, c'est-à-dire pas moi, pas vous, mais ce qui résulte de notre conversation, de notre discussion et de ce qu'on fait ensemble, est-ce que c'est pas là une clé pour comprendre quel peut être le monde de demain et la mondialisation?
Je crois que c'est en tout cas une évolution que la révolution technologique impose. Parce qu'à partir du moment où vous avez un partage, prenons l'exemple d'un cours en ligne, à supposer qu'il ne soit pas uniquement en anglais, parce que je pense en particulier à l'Afrique francophone. Si vous avez ces MOOCs, là, comme on les appelle, Mutual Open Something, là, sûrement, ce sont des lieux d'échange et de partage, et il y a déjà, dans le monde anglo-saxon, une toute autre manière d'enseigner que dans le monde francophone, par exemple. Ça, certainement. Mais étant plutôt de la vieille école, moi, j'aurais tendance à penser que ça dépend des matières. Et ça dépend aussi, me semble-t-il, de la manière dont le professeur conçoit son autorité ou son magistère. Mais ça, je crois encore une fois que vous êtes beaucoup, beaucoup plus qualifié que moi pour répondre à ce genre d'interrogation majeure. Oui ?
Oui, j'étais préoccupée tout à l'heure, vous entendant parler du fait que les deuxièmes générations dans certains pays ont de la peine à s'intégrer, à se sentir part du pays et qu'elles se reconnaissent dans leur religion plutôt que dans la culture du pays où elles sont nées. D'après vous, dans quelle mesure et comment les systèmes d'éducation publique pourraient essayer de rattraper le mouvement et de faire en sorte que ces jeunes qui sont en train de se marginaliser eux-mêmes puissent se retrouver comme appartenant au pays qui finalement les éduque et leur donne un avenir?
Écoutez, je crois que c'est l'un des problèmes essentiels des gouvernements d'aujourd'hui, enfin des personnels politiques aujourd'hui. Et certains pays pensaient avoir la recette. Vous savez qu'il y a eu toujours cette vieille querelle, une de plus, si j'ose dire, franco-britannique, entre la notion très très française d'intégration, la République, Vercingétorix, etc. Enfin, maintenant, Obélix, on n'ose plus en parler. Mais et puis la conception britannique, qui était plus celle de l'assimilation. Bon, on a vu que dans le cas français, l'échec est patent, mais on a vu aussi que dans le cas britannique, le succès n'est pas évident. Et donc c'est pour ça que j'étais très intéressée par cette analyse de ce qui se passe aux Pays-Bas, où il y a eu des crimes racistes. On se souvient de Theo van Gogh, on se souvient de Geert Wilders. Enfin, c'est un pays de grande violence, contrairement à ce que l'on a tendance à penser. Mais on voit bien que même dans une société comme la néerlandaise, qui est une société à la fois très individualiste ou très familiale, dirais-je, et en même temps avec une notion d'intérêt commun très développée, même dans ce pays-là qui a investi plus que d'autres dans l'éducation pour intégrer ces immigrés, on voit encore une fois ce phénomène préoccupant de moindre adhésion et de revendications culturelles ou religieuses chez les jeunes générations d'immigrés. Donc évidemment, je n'ai pas la recette. Mais c'est certainement une préoccupation commune dans plusieurs pays d'Europe. Oui, monsieur.
Il y a une citation que vous devez certainement connaître du poète René Char. « La culture est un héritage, mais il appartient à chacun d'entre nous d'en écrire le testament. » Alors, je ne sais pas ce matin quel testament, après les exposés que nous avons eus, nous serions à même d'écrire. Mais comme vous avez cité l'exemple de la Finlande à plusieurs reprises, et vous n'êtes pas la seule à l'avoir fait, j'aimerais quand même signaler que les Finlandais sont les seuls à apprendre le latin de manière absolument extensive et que l'on peut écouter sur leur programme de télévision chaque matin les nouvelles en latin et qu'ils adorent une forme de musique qui ne leur appartient pas mais qui répond à leur nostalgie, qui est le tango. Et ils ont traduit pratiquement tous les tangos que nous connaissons avec les paroles plus ou moins lestes que nous, Français, avons pu mettre sur ces différents airs. Et tous les tangos faciles sont traduits en latin et écoutés régulièrement en Finlande. Je ne sais pas si c'est ça qui augmente, évidemment, le niveau culturel du pays. Mais il y a, à propos du latin, quand même aussi autre chose, puisque c'est une branche qui, comme le grec, paraît généralement assez élitiste. Comme latiniste, j'aurais tendance à dire que c'est pas vrai, mais enfin, il faut bien essayer de défendre les choses. Un des professeurs de la Sorbonne actuelle prétend que les Romains et les Latins n'ont rien inventé du tout. Alors évidemment, on hurle devant un propos comme celui-ci, mais il poursuit quand même en disant ceci: ils n'ont rien inventé, sinon qu'ils ont su emprunter la culture d'un autre et la transmettre. Le jour où en Europe on saura emprunter la culture chinoise et peut-être la transmettre à nos descendants, ça sera peut-être très amusant, y compris le tibétain.
Oui, mais il ne faut pas oublier le tango. Et d'ailleurs, pour aller dans votre sens, l'ancienne présidente de Finlande s'était rendue extrêmement populaire parce qu'elle refusait de modifier son emploi du temps et de sacrifier ses cours de tango. Donc, elle en prenait 2 par semaine, donc je ne sais pas quel niveau elle a atteint, mais il est un fait que c'est extrêmement, bien vu en Finlande. Oui ?
Bonjour madame, moi je suis prof de médias à une université ici et je m'excuse que je parle si mal français, mais c'est une langue que j'adore. Mais justement, il y a une question qui me vient toujours dans la tête, c'est la question de essayer de retrouver les jeunes en bouleversant nos idées traditionnelles de exactement comment les attirer, pour les introduire aux choses, mais sans leur dire que c'est comme ça qu'il faut le faire, mais introduire des autres idées. Par exemple, je sais que chez moi, on avait des problèmes avec les jeunes qui ne voulaient pas lire et on voulait qu'ils deviennent des meilleurs lecteurs. Alors, ce qu'ils ont dit, ils ont donné des livres qui étaient censurés, interdits, et comme ça, les jeunes, ils aimaient bien lire, ils ont appris comment lire et c'était merveilleux. Alors, moi, je pense que c'est la même chose avec le média aussi. Ce que je voudrais vous demander, s'il n'y a pas des autres chemins pour nous les profs, etc., et pour les gens de médias, pour trouver des autres moyens plus intéressants, plus divers, pour récupérer ces jeunes. Et on n'a pas bien discuté cela, mais je pense que vous devrez avoir des idées.
Oui, je devrais faire une start-up d'ailleurs. Oui, il y a sûrement toutes sortes de manières. On voit. J'étais sidérée. Je suis allée dans un tout petit village de Provence, l'autre jour, dans une librairie très fameuse qui, à elle toute seule, fait vivre ce village. Et j'ai découvert le rayon des mangas. Mais il y en avait 3 tonnes. Il est évident que pour une génération formée à l'image, mais ça c'est déjà la génération des gens de 20 ans, mais maintenant les tout jeunes, c'est même plus l'image, c'est le clic, etc. Il est évident, vous avez raison, qu'il y a toutes sortes de trucs, de trucs à inventer pour les inciter à approfondir ou à plonger dans des choses qui leur paraissent très très rébarbatives. Et certainement, s'agissant de l'apprentissage de l'histoire, la bande dessinée a fait plus que ce qu'on lisait à mon époque, c'est-à-dire en gros Ivanhoé ou des choses comme ça. Et donc, ce qui est frappant en même temps, c'est qu'il y a toujours un décalage, parce que tous ces systèmes sont inventés par des vieux, et il me semble qu'il y a toujours un temps de retard par rapport aux envies des jeunes. Et ce qui est formidable, quels qu'en soient les excès, la vulgarité et surtout la violence, mais ce qui est formidable avec cette explosion de créativité technologique, c'est qu'on voit maintenant de très jeunes gens qui fabriquent des trucs pour des très jeunes. Alors après, tout le problème est de savoir comment cela peut entrer dans un espèce de corpus cohérent, et non pas uniquement servir ou entretenir la violence, qui est évidemment la conséquence directe, me semble-t-il, de ce déferlement de pulsions primaires.
It's now my pleasure to introduce our third speaker of the day, Professor Sugata Mitra, who is Professor of Educational Technology at the School of Education, Communication and Language Sciences at Newcastle University. He's actually flown in from Calcutta to be with us and then flies straight back, so we're very honoured and grateful to you for your travels to be with us. I asked him just before we came back, was there anything in particular that he wanted me to say by way of introduction? And he said, well, just say that the title of my talk isn't the talk I'm going to give, because so much has happened since then, and say that you don't know what I'm going to talk about. But I'm afraid that I'm not going to avoid telling you just about what a distinguished person Professor Mitra is. He has a PhD in physics and is credited with more than 25 inventions in the area of cognitive science and educational technology. His interest in the human mind led him into the areas of learning and memory, and he's amongst the first in the world to show that simulated neural networks can help decipher the mechanisms of Alzheimer's disease. He was amongst the first people to invent voluntary perception recording, a continuously variable voting machine, and a hyperlinked computing environment several years ahead of the internet. His work at NIIT, India's largest multinational training and software services company, he created first curricula and pedagogy for that organisation, followed by years of research into learning styles, learning devices, several of them now patented, multimedia and new methods of learning. This culminated and perhaps towered over his previous work was his hole-in-the-wall experiments with children's learning, where in 1999 a computer was embedded within a wall in an Indian slum in Delhi, and children were allowed to freely use it. The experiment convincingly demonstrated that children could be taught computers very easily without any formal training, and has been frequently repeated. He's termed this minimally invasive education. Since the 1970s, Professor Mitra's publications and work have resulted in training and development for perhaps millions of young Indians, amongst them some of the poorest children in the world. The resultant changes in the lives of people in this country can only be guessed at. I just wanted to tell you about a couple of his many honours and awards. In 2000, the Best Social Innovation of the Year from the Institute of Social Inventions in the UK. And then one I'm sure he's very proud of, the Man for Peace Award in 2002 from the Together for Peace Foundation in Italy. So it's, as I say, with great pleasure that I hand over to Professor Mitra. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you for that introduction. Don't worry about that introduction, because it's not a reflection of what kind of work I've done, it's a reflection of how old I am. As you get older, your biodata gets longer and longer. This talk was planned quite some time ago. And I was in UK. I live in a little city called Gateshead, which is very close. Then, as things turned out, which I will describe, a whole set of experiments started off in India. And it was getting really expensive to keep going back and forth between UK and India to monitor those. So I decided to spend about 4 months, or 5 months actually, in Calcutta, in India. So then I sort of wrote in and I said, look, this is what's happened. And, the conference said, well, we'll just get you from Calcutta. So that's how I ended up coming from Calcutta and going back to Calcutta. Then the talk itself. Now, because it had been planned quite some time ago, I had written up an abstract. And then, yesterday on the plane, I thought to myself, but that abstract, I have many more things to say after that. So what shall I do? So then I came here and I told her that I'm not going to talk only about that, I'm going to talk about something else. It's like a story. It's like a story in children's education, which I must tell you first, is not my subject. I've never studied education as a subject. So there are big gaps in my understanding of that whole area of education. My formal subject is physics. It's an interesting little side story of how I landed myself in education. And then having landed myself in education, I didn't know any of the tools. So I had to use what I knew, which is the methods that experimental physicists use in order to understand what I was seeing. So I want to try and tell you where that story is leading to or what it's pointing at. So I tentatively called it the future of learning. But to look at the future of anything, you obviously need to look at where it came from. Wait, my computer's waking up. So we need to look at the origins of schooling. And schooling's been around for a very long time. And it's been around more or less in this same kind of format, as you can see on the screen. There is a teacher, there are some children, there is some medium on which the teacher can write, and etc. Who invented it? And most importantly, what is its purpose? So I tried reading up on this, and you'll find it's very surprising. It's really difficult to find out the origins of schooling. It seems to be almost as old as the time when human beings changed from hunter-gatherers to agrarian. When they started taming the crops and the animals, somebody somewhere thought that there are important pieces of information that needs to be transmitted from generation to generation. We don't know who or where. But schooling in its existing form has a much more recent history. And you can trace it, and it is documented. it comes from, as far as I can tell, it comes from a bygone age about 200 years ago, at which time on this planet we had empires. So, and if you look at the biggest of the last and the biggest of those empires, here it is. Now consider running this empire, keeping it operational, sitting in that one corner on a little island. How would you do it? How would you know what's happening? How would you know the results of any action that you've taken? How would you know what the financial position of the whole world is? So, the people who run that empire, the Victorians, they were amongst other empires which were there on the planet as well, but I took this one because it's the last one. They invented a method for monitoring and running this empire. Remember, this was a time when there were no telephones, no telegraph, no computers. What the Victorians did was to create a network of computers, except that the computers were made of people. So if you have to make a computer out of people, what would you need to do? They must be able to read, they must be able to write, and they must be able to do arithmetic. So the three principal skills that are needed to make a human computer are very well documented. And like mechanical computers, each human computer must be prepared to do the task that it has to do. The Victorians invented or decided to convert schools into this computer-making factories. You needed literally millions of them. This whole global human computer, in English we call it the bureaucratic administrative machinery. It's run by machines, except that the machines are flesh and blood. So what do you need to do in these schools? You need to produce, well, here it is, the Victorian system. If you look at that picture, it doesn't look very different from this picture in front of me. It was built so solidly that it still remains. What was its purpose? Its purpose was to create identical people. Absolutely identical people. What were these people called? Well, they were called by various names, but the lowest rung, the real human computers, they were called clerks. The school, a certain kind of school, became a clerk-making factory. This is a picture from 18-something, and its title says, "The National Union of Clerks." Everybody is identical to everybody else. So, we know what that system was engineered to do. And you can't blame them for it. They needed it. They can't run that administrative machinery without these identical people. You should be able to take a clerk from New Zealand and send him to Canada and know that he'll know exactly where to sit and what to do. You needed other identical people to defend the empire. So identical that the clothes that they wear are actually called uniform. You have to be uniform. Then the age of empires ended, and the action moved to North America with the Industrial Revolution. The captains of the US industry looked at the system and said, this is fantastic. We need identical consumers with identical desires being serviced by identical people. So they continued. Okay, look at those women on that line. Do you want creativity? Do you want any difference from each other? Not at all. You want them exactly the same. So, given that history, and given the fact that there was a good reason for that system to exist, it was to maintain the world. Given the fact that the Victorians were good builders, so good that they built a system that is so robust that it still remains until today. But for whom? The empires are over. The manufacturing has moved east. So what are these products going to do? Well, we heard a little bit about it. 45% of them will find nothing to do. So I asked myself this question. Who wants your educated child when you send him to a school? What's the purpose? Well, you can get some answers. The parents. Parents are very important for schools because of several reasons. Firstly, because they produce children. Secondly, they have a certain picture in their mind of what they want their child to be like. And it is with that expectation that they send their children to your school and they pay for it. So let's say that's that little rectangle there, that's the picture in the parent's mind. That's how I want my son or my daughter. You know the requirements. They should be happy, they should be nice people, they should bring up nice children and grandchildren, etc., etc. Nice is the name of the game. So they have their requirement. The school has to satisfy them. If you don't, they'll take away their child. So the directors and the principals sit down and they look at their methodologies. So what can we do to satisfy the parent? But there is another customer for the child. The government. The government too is very important for the school because the government, in many, many cases, either directly or indirectly, pays for and permits the school to operate. So we must find out what the government wants. Well, the government wants good quality citizens. A good quality citizen is the kind of fellow that, doesn't run around in the supermarkets with a mobile phone in his hand yelling and screaming. So the government wants you to produce such upright citizens. And they have many other requirements. However, if you look at the government's requirements, is it exactly the same as the parents' requirements? There are many things in common, but not all. There are a few things which the government wants, which the parent says, well, it's okay. That your child should regularly vote and vote for the right people in the right ballot box. The parent says, okay, that's all right if he does. But the school, they have to sit and think. How are we going to meet the government's expectations? Which overlaps the parents, but there is a little extra. So they design certain other things, which is to serve the government. However, there's a third customer also waiting outside the school gates. And he doesn't pay the school. He is the prospective employer of the child that emerges. Now, because he doesn't pay the school, and because he has no hand in sending the children to your school, we don't really care about what he wants. So the employer in country after country says, these children, they've come out, but we have to train them to do everything. They don't know, what do they teach in these schools? I don't understand. They don't understand that we don't care what they want. But there is yet another customer. And that customer we seldom even think about, leave alone consider. That customer are the peers of the child. His friends, the people he hangs out with. What do the peers want your child to be like? Well, you can summarize in one word. The peers want your child to be cool. It is factored nowhere in their schooling. School is not cool. So what is cool is out of school. What is cool is the ability to download an app and use it instantly. What is cool is to be able to pick up a guitar and run a whip shot ditty or whatever. What is cool is to buy new shoes as quickly and as often as you can. We don't deal with any of that. At least I don't know. I haven't seen your curriculum, but I don't know if there's a section that says how to buy shoes effectively. So we don't deal with them. But now let's look at another factor. You are, let's say you're preparing, one of your children is 8 years old. Now, a child who is 8 years old in 2013 is most likely going to live for another 100 years, at least. So, you are going to prepare this 8-year-old for the next 100 years, when you don't even know how to write an app. So how are we going to do that? What is it that we are going to prepare them for? And yet another factor. 40 years from today, when that 8-year-old is about 48 or 50, the parents, they're either gone or almost gone. The government has changed about 15 times. So we don't know what they want anymore. The employers, we can't even imagine what they're like, what those new jobs are 50 years from now. So the two people that you designed for, they're not there anymore. The third person, the employer for whom you may have provided some lip service, he too is gone. What your 8-year-old today is left with are his peers, with whom he's going to live the rest of his life, and for whom you never designed. So you're going to leave him without any tools in a world which is totally different from what you prepared him for. That seems to be more or less where we are right now. Even if you broke out of the Victorian model, you still aren't looking for the peer model or looking at what peers want. So education is not designed for the only people who will be with you forever. So then let's come to our century now. So here's the 21st century. And there are those kids. These particular ones are they're from Chile, I think. And what they're doing is they're reading English. They've never been taught English. I gave them that computer and I said, "Can you read English?" And they said, "No." So I said, "I'll tell you what, I'll allow you to access the internet." They said, "That's not allowed in school." I said, I'll let you do it for the next 1 hour. They said, how will we read? I said, can 3 or 4 of you get together and read this passage? 30 minutes later, they read Key Stage 2 in English, using Google Translate, using online dictionaries, and using each other. Okay? I'm sure neither the parents nor the government will be happy with this, but they were very happy. Well, are there signs that the existing system has a few cracks in it? Just a couple of months ago, I was in Boston, and a news item appeared that which said 150 Harvard undergraduates caught cheating. So I was absolutely astonished, because Harvard undergraduates they're the best in the world. So what's going on? So I put up a post on my Facebook page saying this can't be true. There has to be something wrong. And the next day there was a response from the Students' Union which effectively said, we didn't know we were cheating. The assignment said, collaboration is encouraged. Using of internet resources is encouraged. So we collaborated. We texted each other and we figured out who amongst us can write the best assignment. She wrote it and then she uploaded it to her website on the internet. When you upload something to an internet website, it becomes an internet resource. The rest of us downloaded it. Well, you're laughing, but I saw it as the first of the cracks in the system. And the crack appeared not in some developing country, not in a slum school. The crack appeared on the walls of Harvard, world number 1. Just to give you yet another example which I came across very recently, a nephew of mine who's about, I think he's 6, and his mother was, annoyed with him because he wasn't multiplying properly. And she was saying, you must learn how to multiply. I mean, why aren't you practicing more how to multiply? So when she had left the room for a few minutes, I quietly asked my nephew, he's actually my nephew's son, I forget how old I am. I quietly asked my nephew's son, so how do you multiply numbers? And with a big smile on his face, he said, with my phone. So, cracks in the system. So that's not very visible, but anyway, what I'm trying to say is that schooling, with its military and industrial background, as we know it now, is obsolete. It's outdated. I mean, when lots of things get outdated, and when they do, we generally feel very sorry about it. But that doesn't mean that things should not get outdated. Just to give you an example, the fountain pen. You remember the fountain pen? You had to unscrew it, you had to pour ink into it, you had to screw it back. It had a nib. If you were rich, you could have a gold nib. And then you took it out of your pocket and you wrote very carefully and you had lovely handwriting. It went and got replaced by cheap plastic ballpoints, which produced bad handwriting. But everybody on the planet could have one. So you lose some and you gain some, but things get outdated. There is yet another phenomenon which is worth paying attention to. I don't know how many people in this room recognize the object on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Well, it's called a radiogram. It was a large piece of furniture. It had a record player on one side and it had a radio on the other side. And the radio took about 4 minutes to warm up before it started speaking. It was an expensive piece of furniture in the living room. And we were, whoever had it was very proud of it. He would call his neighbors and say, see, look at my radiogram. You'll never be able to afford one. And so on. Then came the tape recorder. And the tape recorder was now only this big and was only 20 kilos. So everybody said, my goodness, this is portable. You could now carry your radiogram from the living room to the bedroom, alone. The Japanese changed all that. They converted the tape recorder into a palm-sized device, the Walkman. And I still remember my father saying to me, why on earth would anybody want to carry their radiogram in their pocket? But we all started doing it. Then the Walkman became still smaller. It became the MP3 player. Now it was the size of a postage stamp. And it was so light and so cheap and so small that you could, sort of come back home and slap your pockets. Oh, I lost my radiogram. Anyway, I'll get another one. But what happened to the MP3 player is fairy tale. The MP3 player vanished. It vanished into a cloud of zeros and ones. And all you needed was anything that can access the internet, and you could have all the music you want, you could have all the videos you want, or all of any digital media that you wanted. It dematerialized. The radiogram dematerialized. And that's an amazing concept, isn't it? It's stuff that we used to read in fairy tales. Somebody waved a wand at something and it vanished. Well, the radiogram did. So then I got to thinking, what else is dematerializing? Lots of things. The biggest example, the banks. I know I'm in the country of banks. They still have their great big buildings to show that they have lots of money. But what do they say to their customers? Don't come here. Everything's in the cloud. Okay. Along with the banks, money itself is dematerializing. For those of you who, all of us do, we carry an object which is from another age, which has very little significance, but all of us carry it still, is the purse. What do you need it for? All you need is one plastic card inside, which is what you keep pulling out all the time anyway. Okay? It's even got a change pocket. What do you need the change for? Because everything is priced X.99, and they give you back that 1 penny. If we stop that, can you imagine how many megatons of metal would not need to be mined in a world where all you need is a plastic card to do the transaction with? So money will go. There is and this is not me saying, that there's a very respected journal called IEEE Spectrum. IEEE stands for the Institution of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. About a few months ago, their cover story was the last days of cash. So, look at your curriculum. Doesn't it have sums which say that I bought 3 loaves of bread and I gave a note of 10, how much change do I get back? What do you want that for? This is the 21st century, for heaven's sake. It should be changed. I bought 2 loaves of bread. I swiped my card. It said transaction declined. What could be the reason? If you look back at your curriculum, you'll find lots of little things like that lying in there from, well, let me give you an example. in England, in the 9-year-old's curriculum, there is a section which is called erosion of river banks. That, you know, when rivers eat into their sides, what are those structures called, and this, that, the other thing. So I was talking to the teacher and saying, when in her life is this 9-year-old girl going to need this information? So she's laughing also. She said, I don't know where it came from. I said, I know where it came from. It came from a time when she may have had to be on a ship that was going down an unknown river, and she needed to know where to park. About 200 years ago is when that piece was put into the curriculum. It's still lying there like a little dinosaur, and you're all teaching it. So it's a very instructive exercise to sit and look at your curriculum and find out where all these little pieces are. There are lots of them lying around. And if somebody could just take all that junk out and put in instead, well, how to write an app. So what do you think of that? I mean, imagine that I've taken a room out there in Geneva, downtown Geneva. I've put up a signboard saying Sugata Mitra, Chartered Accountant. Inside I have a desk, and under the desk there is a little tablet with Google on it. And I've invented a dematerialized keyboard, so I can type in midair like this. You come in as my customer and you say, I have a problem with my balance sheet. So I say, a problem with what? So you say, balance sheet. I say, oh, balance sheet, yes. Did you bring a hard copy? So you say, yes, I did. I said, leave it with me. Come back tomorrow. As soon as you leave, I get onto Google. I get onto networking. I get onto websites of chartered accountants. I get onto YouTube. I get onto Facebook. In a few hours, I've solved the problem. You come back the next day, and then you go back and you tell your friends, you know that new accountant, Sugata Mitra? He's kind of funny because every time you ask him anything, he kind of looks down and, twiddles his fingers, and he talks very slowly. But otherwise, he does get the job done, and he's quite cheap. So I pretend like that to be a chartered accountant. Now the next day another customer comes, and he also has a problem with the balance sheet. On the second day, do I look up balance sheet again? I don't, obviously, because I looked it up yesterday. So I look up something else. Each day I pretend like that for a year. At the end of the year, people in Geneva are saying, Sugata, that accountant, he's quite all right. He's got some idiosyncrasies, but other than that, he's quite fine. 3 years pass, and you suddenly find public lecture at the chambers of the Chartered Accountants of Switzerland by the famous chartered accountant Sugata Mitra. So is it pretense? Or is it that you become what you pretend? If you pretend long enough. I mean, all of you have, degrees in teaching. So when you came out of your institution carrying that piece of paper which says you are now a trained teacher, were you a teacher or were you pretending to be one? Isn't it that 20 years later you look back and say, I didn't know anything about teaching then, I know now? You become what you pretend. If that is true, if that is the process of learning or the process of education, then Google is a very powerful tool. What's wrong with Google? Bring it into the classroom. So how did I bump into all this? Well, 14 years ago, I was doing pretty much a technical job, teaching people how to write programs and, that sort of thing. And there were slum children outside my office who obviously couldn't afford such expensive courses. So I didn't like that. So I decided I would give them a computer. How do you give a computer in a slum? Well, I made a hole in the wall, stuck the computer inside, put a glass sheet in front of it. It was about 3 feet off the ground. There was a touchpad. I turned it on and I left it there just to see what would happen. 8 hours later, a colleague of mine came running back into my room and said, I don't know how it's possible, but those kids are browsing and they're teaching each other how to browse. So I said, but they don't go to school and they don't know any English. So how is this happening? So they said, you know what? Somebody must have been passing by, one of your students, and showed them how to use the mouse or the touchpad. So I repeated the experiment about 300 miles away. This one was done in New Delhi, India. I repeated it 300 miles away in a very rural place and stuck a similar computer in the wall, left it there, in a village where the chances of a passing software developer would be 0. I came back after 3 months and I found 2 children were playing a game. As soon as they saw me, they said, oh, we need a faster processor and a better mouse. So I said, how do you know that? How do you know all this? So they said, now this is very important for everybody here. They said, you've given us a machine. They didn't know it was called a computer. You've given us a machine that works only in English. So we taught ourselves English to use it. Okay? And as a teacher, it was the first time I'd heard anything like that. So I decided to, by that time I got some funding. And I decided that I would repeat this experiment to see if these results are accidental or they will happen everywhere. So here's a glimpse of those years. This is the first day at what the press called the hole in the wall. This is a 6-year-old student of a 8-year-old teacher. Well, you won't understand the language, but that was a village in Rajasthan, the desert area of India, where I left the computer. Now those children in that village, that particular village, their entertainment is to sing together. So, which is very nice because they sing these desert songs together. So when I asked them, I said, but why singing? Why don't you play something else? And they said something very nice. They said it doesn't cost any money. So those children, when confronted with the computer, in just 24 hours, found the sound recorder in Windows and recorded themselves. And what they were doing was listening to themselves for the first time. So that again was a big puzzle for me. Why only the sound recorder? Why not anything else? How did they bump across the one thing that was relevant to what they wanted? Anyway, I went on studying this, and the results were, as you can see in that curve. By the way, all this is published and available on the internet. What this curve shows is that given unsupervised access to computers, groups of children in 9 months' time will reach from 0 to the same level of computer literacy as the average office secretary in the West. Which means they would know email, they would They would be able to use Word. They would be, what secretaries do, Twitter, Facebook, and all that. So they would pick all that up by themselves. But the requirement was, and this was my biggest challenge and my biggest puzzle, the requirement was groups and the absence of supervision. So we came to this conclusion that groups of children can operate computers by themselves, which back in 1999 was a very big result, because people said, what's the repercussion on training? Today, of course, we know that 2.5-year-olds can operate an iPad. At that time, another question began to be asked, where people said, once they had gotten over the initial surprise, they said, so what? So what? You've given them a computer, they've learned how to use the computer. So what's going to happen to them? You've gone away. I didn't have an answer to the question. But I had a very lucky break. Many years later, an Indian filmmaker was driving down the western coast of India when she came across a village. And in that village, she found 2 computers sticking out of a wall, still working. And there were children around it. So she got down from the car. She went up to the children, and the children said, "These are children's computers." So she said, no, I'm not going to touch them. But who put them there? She didn't know me at that time. So the children said, oh, a long, long time ago, a man from Delhi had come and put these computers in the wall, and he never came back. So she stopped to see what had happened. And what she found, she made a documentary on it, of which I'm going to show you a small clip, which tells the story of a village school teacher and one of his students. And I've sort of shortened it. It's about 6 minutes long, but I think you'll enjoy it. Unfortunately, the language will be Hindi, and there are English subtitles. So what I will do, I thought about it. I said, should I not show it? I think I should show it. But I'll tell you the summary of it, which kind of spoils the fun a little bit. But the summary of it is that the village school teacher went on. In their village, they had no water. And the women had to walk 4 or 5 kilometers to get water. What the school teacher did was that he used Google Earth to locate the village and to find out where the rainwater goes and where it seeps into the ground, and therefore how many feet would he have to dig to get a well. His calculations showed a particular spot at 16 feet. At 14 feet. He found the water at 16. And then it shows the story of a very short story of a student. That one's going to be a surprise. Well, here goes.
तो गोवा की बॉर्डर शुरू होती है, वहाँ पे हमारा एक गांव है छोटा सा. एक बाजू में पूरा समंदर है, एक बाजू में पूरा सह्याद्री है, और इस दोनों के बीच हमारा गांव है. इस रिमोट प्लेस में कोई भी सुविधा नहीं थी. ऐसे इस टाइम 5 साल पहले हमारे स्कूल में NIT और ICICI इनके दोनों के माध्यम से हमारे स्कूल में क्यूआर सेंटर दिखाया है 2002 में. तो क्यूआर सेंटर का मतलब ही यही था कि बच्चों कंप्यूटर कैसा सीखते हैं, बच्चों की सीखने की पद्धति कौन सी है. 8 से 10-20 तक हमारे स्कूल में के के जो आने वाले बच्चे हैं वो हर बच्चे सब बच्चे क्यूआर सेंटर को जाते हैं, उसमें कंप्यूटर जो है और देखने वाले 20 रहते हैं। 2 कंप्यूटर एक का एक सेटअप होता है। 2 दिन 3 दिन जाके देखते थे अपने को कुछ करने आता है क्या इसका, वो जायजा लेते थे, वापस फिरते थे। आहिस्ता आहिस्ता बच्चों की भीड़ क्यूआर सेंटर पे बढ़ने लगी और बच्चे तो गेम्स ओपन करने लगे। गेम खेलते खेलते को थक जाते तो नया नया एक एक प्रोग्राम ओपन करते थे, यानी कि पेंट ब्रश ओपन करते थे।
सेवेंथ में था तो हमारे स्कूल में कियोस्क लग गया। लग जाने के बाद मैं हर रोज़ वहाँ पे जाता था और पहले तो कुछ पता नहीं था क्या करते, कंप्यूटर कभी देखा नहीं था, हार्डली कभी स्कूल में लेक्चर्स के टाइम कभी सर ने दिखाया था, उतना ही। लेकिन बाद में मैं हमेशा जाने लगा और
जब कियोस्क आया तो कभी जाओ वो हमेशा खुला रहता था और कुछ भी कर सकते थे।
बात होने से बच्चों को तुरंत समझ में आने लगा कि गूगल सर्च।
और कियोस्क पे भी बहुत मज़ा आता था, जब मुझे चाहिए करके जब हम वहाँ पे झगड़ा करते थे, नहीं मैं भी बैठूंगी, क्योंकि वो सिर्फ 2 ही थे और हम बहुत सारे बच्चे, तो बहुत मज़ा आता था।
लोग घड़ा लेके 4 किलोमीटर जाते थे पानी के लिए। आज हमारे गांव में इतना पानी है, पानी की कोई दिक्कत नहीं है। गूगल अर्थ से मेरा गांव मैंने पूरा सिलेक्ट किया है, इसका यूज कर जा सकता है, मेरा तो ऊपर नहीं आ सकता। इसके लिए इस सैटेलाइट मैप का बहुत यूज हुआ कि परफेक्ट लोकेशन पे हम पानी रुकाएंगे तो उस पानी पूरा ज़मीन में जा सकता है और पानी के वाटर लेवल चेंज हो सकती है। तो हमने क्या किया, जहाँ पे कुआं निकालना था स्कूल के यहाँ पे माइस में, इसका जो शूट किया हमने तो उसका हाइट मिलता है हमें।
डिस्टेंस बिटवीन द अर्थ एंड कैमरा।
तालाब से निकले हुआ जो एक नाला है छोटा सा, उस नाले को स्कूल के नजदीक है, यहाँ पे स्पॉट दिया है हमने, इसका हाइट निकाला, उसका हाइट और स्कूल के एरिया का जो हम जहाँ पे ये निकाले उसका हाइट का डिफरेंस निकाला। वो 14 फुट का तो निकला, 14 फुट का डिफरेंस है, ये 14 फुट ऊपर है, वो 14 फुट नीचे है। तो हमने कॉमन लॉजिक यूज किया कि 14 फुट हम कुआं निकालेंगे तो इस पे पानी लगेगा, क्योंकि उसके जो फ्लो रहते हैं वो डेप्थ में रहते हैं। और हमें 16 फुट पे पानी लगा है।
मैं कियोस्क पे जाके सर्च करता था गूगल पे, तब मुझे एक वेबसाइट मिली न्यू साइंटिस्ट, उसमें बहुत सारे आर्टिकल्स आते थे और मुझे बचपन से ही जीन्स और डीएनए उसमें बहुत इंटरेस्ट था, क्यूरियोसिटी थी ये क्या है एग्जैक्टली, तो इसलिए और वो आर्टिकल्स उसमें से पढ़ के मुझे और इंटरेस्ट डेवलप हो गया और मैंने 10th में डिसाइड किया कि आई गो फॉर बायोटेक्नोलॉजी।
So he's studying evolutionary biology in Yale. So now, what caused that? The 2 computers stuck in a wall. So when I saw that, in my old subject, physics, we have a branch which says that when an input to a system produces a disproportionately large output, then what is operating in between is a self-organizing system. So that was after this video was when I first thought to myself, maybe I have encountered a self-organizing system where a tiny input will cause a big output, which then changes the teacher's job completely. The teacher's job then becomes to figure out what is that tiny input for any given topic which will produce that disproportionate output. I started experimenting with this with different subjects and discovered that you can do it with almost anything. So in those days, the conclusion that I had come to was that groups of children using the internet can achieve educational objectives on their own. Now, until now, school teachers used to be my very good friends. After this one, they started getting a little, serious. Around that same time, I came to Newcastle on a research project. It was a large fund for improving schooling in India. So Newcastle called me and said, you come here and you do that. So I was in Newcastle and I gave a similar seminar, and my colleagues asked me, aren't you overstating it when you say that they can achieve educational objectives? How many objectives? How difficult? In what subject? In other words, how far can it go? I didn't have an answer to this question, so I decided I would design an experiment. I would design an experiment that was designed to fail. The research question was, can Tamil-speaking children, Tamil is a South Indian language, can Tamil-speaking children from a village in India teach themselves the biotechnology of DNA replication in English from a street-side computer on their own? And I thought, oh, what a lovely social science question I have made. I'll give them a pretest, they'll get a 0. I'll give them a post-test after a couple of months, they'll get another 0. I'll go back to Newcastle and I'll say, we need teachers. So I found a village, and I had built 2 hole-in-the-wall computers in that village. So the children knew me. So I just downloaded a lot of material on DNA replication, genetics, into those computers. I called the children and I said, this is very complicated, and it's all in English, but it's very interesting. So the children looked at it and said, how can we understand this? It's all in English. It's got huge chemistry words. How do we understand? But by that time, I had developed my new pedagogical method, which was to say, I have no idea. And anyway, there's no place in this village to stay, so I'm going away. So I left them, and I came back after 2 months, and they came in very quietly and said, we've understood nothing. So I said, okay, how many times did you look at it? So they said, we looked every day, we'd still look. So I said, what do you look at? So then one girl raised her hand. She was 12 years old at that time. And she said to me, apart from the fact that improper replication of the DNA molecule causes genetic disease, we've understood nothing else. So then I had pre-tested them, they had got a 0. I post-tested them and got an educational impossibility. You won't find this in any book on education. 0 to 30% by themselves, under a tree, in the tropical heat, in a language they don't know, on a subject that is taught in master's level courses. But there it was. But still I couldn't go back to Newcastle, because in the Victorian system, 30% is a fail. How do I make them pass? I can't get a biotechnology teacher. But I found that they had a 22-year-old friend, a girl who was an accountant with a local NGO, and she sort of played games with them. So I asked that girl, can you help them? So she said, no, I can't help them, because I didn't have any science in school. And anyway, I don't know what they do with those computers all day long. So I said, well, use the method of the grandmother. So she said, what? So I said, stand behind them. Whenever they do anything, just say, wow, fantastic. How did you do that? Can you do some more? And so on. She did this very well for 2 more months. The results jumped to 50%. Same as my control school in New Delhi, which is a rich private school with a trained biotechnology teacher. So when I saw that graph, then I knew that there was another way. There had to be. So I came back to Newcastle looking for grandmothers. I put out calls in newspapers saying, if you are a British grandmother, if you have broadband and a web camera, and if you can give me 1 hour of your time per week for free, then please contact me. In 2 weeks, I got 200. I know more British grandmothers than anybody you know. So I wanted to call them e-mediators, that, they'll mediate over Skype. But my students changed the name and called it the Granny Cloud. So the Granny Cloud sits on the internet. Wherever a school is in trouble, you beam a gran over Skype, and she appears on their wall. Okay? It's just fantastic to watch. There are a couple of them, they're experienced school teachers with 30 years of experience. And I still remember one where she's sitting in a little village in England somewhere, and there's this rowdy classroom full of 10-year-olds in Hyderabad, India, in a slum. And she goes, shh, and 5,000 miles away, the class quietens. So then I decided to bring this whole thing into the classroom. Not just the classrooms of disadvantaged schools, but the classrooms of the best schools in the world. Because if it was going to be an alternative, then that alternative would apply to everybody. How do you bring the hole in the wall into the classroom? Well, it's very simple. When I tried to explain to myself what had happened in that village, Kuppam, where they taught themselves biotechnology, if I had to ask myself, why did it happen? There was only one answer, unfortunately. The answer was, it happened because I went away. So, you can bring the hole in the wall in the classroom. Get a few computers. Get one computer for every 5 children, not more than that. Get broadband, tell them they can do whatever they want, and leave. But if you set a question, each time you'll find, when you come back, you've got an answer. It's called a self-organized learning environment. Now, the BBC made a film on it, and again, I've extracted that. I know I'm short of time, but I am going to play this one. It's about 5 minutes, and it will give you an idea of the whole process.
Val Almond and Debbie Mann are the vanguard of a revolutionary new approach to global education. Once a week they log onto their computers to talk to, read and play games with groups of children from remote parts of India.
Hello. My name is Debbie and I live in Loughborough, which is in the middle of England. Can you see this picture?
Yes.
What is it?
Yeah.
This cross-cultural education project is the brainchild of Professor Siddhartha Mitra, who, originally from India himself, took on a post at the University of Newcastle 4 years ago.
What's the problem at the heart of what you're trying to address?
You can have places where you can't build a school. Such places exist in the world. And even more commonly, you can have places where you have schools, but good teachers don't want to or cannot go. So what do you do about that then? Because there are children everywhere. And that's what I'm trying to address.
Let's talk about how this started.
Well, that was 12 years ago, and at that time I was working in Delhi and I was training people to learn how to program computers. And only the rich children got the opportunity to join these expensive training programs. The poor children did not. but there was nothing to prevent the poor children from having the abilities to be excellent programmers. So I thought to myself, what would happen if I put a computer like an ATM in a wall in a slum?
What Sugata observed was that children would flock to these hole-in-the-wall computers and without any knowledge of IT and little or no English, teach themselves how to use them.
And when I asked them, they said, well, if you've given us a computer which works in English, then we have to teach ourselves English in order to use it, which sounds very simple, but that's what they were doing. The lesson from that first 5 years of experiments is that groups of children given access to a computer in an unsupervised environment will be capable of self-instructing them to use it.
Sugata then took his experiment a step further to see if he could deepen the children's learning experience.
I asked a friendly girl in the neighborhood who they sort of played with. I asked her to pretend or to use what I now describe as the method of the grandmother, which is that you stand behind the children and you admire them. Every time they do something, you say, well, I couldn't have done that. My God, when I was a kid, I would have never been able to find this. The children love that, obviously, and they want to show off to that figure. So when I came back to Britain, I started a recruitment drive, so to speak, for grandmothers who have broadband and who are willing to give me 1 hour of their time every week for free.
Excellent. Again.
What's their job? Their job is to provide that additional 20% boost to the children by admiring them.
Excellent. Give yourselves a clap.
That's what I'm trying to achieve in India using the British granny cloud, as it's called.
And there are now about 200 people from all over the UK in the granny cloud. You don't actually have to be a granny to take part, though.
Grizzly, fantastic, well done.
Can you tell me what this is I am wearing and who would wear it? The Queen, absolutely.
Hello, I'm Tim.
How are you?
I'm all right. Have you heard of a footballer called Wayne Rooney?
Yes.
What sort of bear does Wayne Rooney look like?
Teddy bear.
A teddy bear.
So many children in the world don't have access to education because of the remote area they live in, they're poor, whatever. Can you see how the leaves have dropped from the trees? That's very near to where I live. But through technology, you can get through to the poorest of children.
And Sugata's new teaching methods have now also arrived on these shores. The lessons learned from his very first experiment in India with hole-in-the-wall computers are now being applied to schools in Gateshead.
Stephen? Bonjour. Bonjour, good.
The process is that you take a group of children, you ask them to make groups of 4. Each group of 4 is allowed to use one computer with an internet connection. And then you trigger off the system with a question. That question is absolutely critical.
What I want you to find out for me today is, where does language come from? I don't know the answer.
Where are you going to start looking?
It's got to put it on time. Some scientists say that language is the very thing that makes human. Where does language come from?
What website's this? Wiki Answers? Would it not be easier if the teacher just told you where language came from?
No, because then we won't be learning anything for ourselves. When you get a hard question, and if you find it out, it makes you feel much older.
Do you?
You might not understand the little Geordie accents, but he asked the first child, isn't it easier if the teacher told you the answer? And he said, but then that's not the same as finding it out for myself. Then he asked the little girl, so what happens when you do it this way? And she said, I feel much older. She's 8 years old, so he asked her how old she felt, and she said 9.5. So, by the way, there's an e-book which I wrote, and it has a very interesting foreword written by Nicholas Negroponte. It's very short. You can read it in about 2 hours. It's called Beyond the Hole in the Wall. So by this time, teachers were getting interested all over the northeastern part of England. So I went all over Durham County, I went all over Northumberland. The teachers started talking to each other, and then they started to spread. Then I started getting calls from the south of England, then from Scotland, then from Europe, from Italy, from Spain, Portugal, then from South America, then from North America, then from China and Australia. So I kept flying and kept showing this method to the teachers there, and they would write in about their own experiences. And you'll find all this on the web, of teachers talking to each other, of reporting successes, of reporting failures, and so on and so forth. But what all of them have to say is that every sole self-organized learning environment works in exactly the same way, no matter which country it's done in. I like that, because that sounds like physical science to me. So what's my position right now on this? Well, I know I'm in front of a whole lot of teachers, so maybe it's the wrong place to say it. But groups of children can learn anything by themselves, provided they can read, search, understand, and believe. You know, when you read, when you search, you get a lot of things, you read it, but finally you have to believe, you have to come to a conclusion. If they had these 4 basic abilities, they could teach themselves anything. So if we want to speculate in terms of physics, then learning is an emergent phenomenon if you allow the education to be a self-organizing system. It just comes by itself. So the new primary curriculum becomes very simple, really. Reading comprehension becomes the single most important thing that you need to teach at the earliest possible age. So this whole idea of key stages in reading, we have to collapse that. We have to find the way to do that. Information search and retrieval, well, that's not a problem. The kids are anyway better at it than we are. And finally, I don't know how to do this. You'll have to tell me. How do you develop a rational system of belief by which they can evaluate what they're reading? A child who can do that, given a tablet phone, can learn anything. There's another very interesting take on this whole thing which comes out of neuroscience. It became only recently possible to see the brain working using magnetic resonance imaging. And what they say, and I'm just going to summarize very, very quickly, what they say is that learning works at its optimal if you reduce threat perception. You know, in the brain, particularly in our animal brain, the limbic brain, we run away from threat and we look for pleasure. What the neuroscientists say is that when you're under threat, your rational thinking stops. And you get this response called flight or fright. Also, when you're exceedingly happy, when you're exhilarated, then also the rational part stops. So both are not good for learning. You have to keep the needle in the middle. That's the teacher's job. So remove all threat perception, replace it with pleasure, but not exhilaration. Also, creative thinking seems to appear quickly if you stop rational thinking without scaring people. Then the rest of their brains activate, which may be the reason why mathematicians like Lewis Carroll wrote nonsense rhymes, because maybe they understood intuitively that it triggers off other parts of the brain. And finally, it's my own personal feeling. You are free to believe it or not believe it. Do not medicate for fictitious disease. You know, an 8-year-old's mother comes and says, my son is not paying any attention in class. And you say, well, he's got attention deficit disorder. Instead of asking the mother, what did you do to make him this way? So for God's sake, don't medicate the child. If anything, medicate the mother. So I'm going to leave you with a few questions. You know, accessing the internet is getting easier and easier and easier. One of these days, these little mobile phones, they are going to dematerialize. And they'll be replaced by something which I don't know, which will be totally, totally undetectable. What happens to examinations then? How do you examine a connected learner? What does a qualification mean in a world where I can become a chartered accountant with Google? What is a curriculum anyway? You know, there's a famous problem called STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. Students are increasingly turning away from them. I went to the US and met some of these students and their teachers. And yes, it is of concern. They are turning away from it. But I found out what they're doing. They write apps and they create servers in their bedrooms. But that's not science, technology, engineering, mathematics, because we don't know anything about them. So I think we better look at our definitions first before we label a whole generation as STEM. Okay? They don't want to know how a steam engine works because it doesn't matter anymore. Is arithmetic obsolete? I gave a prize to a little kid for being able to recite the 17 times tables. So of course I congratulated her. I said, this is very good. Then later on I asked her, what is 17 times 17? So she said, that's not allowed. It's only up to 10. Then I said, can you tell me 23 times tables? So she said, that's not allowed. It stops at 20. So then I realized, my God, this is a matrix. 1 to 20 into 1 to 10. A good old Victorian arithmetic matrix to be stuffed into the brain of every clerk in the empire. Why are we stuffing that same thing in today? You have to ask yourself, is arithmetic obsolete? I know this is going to sound terrible, but the mobile phones can do the arithmetic for us. Is the absence of a teacher a pedagogical tool? Well, I've found it to be so. You check for yourself. Will institutions dematerialize? Will one day places like this be empty halls where people will pay 10 euros for a guided tour with a guide and they'll whisper to each other, so that's how they used to educate? Could happen. It's happened before in history. And so what will the future teacher do? It's a nice job. Find out what's the smallest thing you can do to produce the biggest learning outcome. And then sit back and watch it happen. What can be better than that? And I'm going to leave you with one last question to which I do not have an answer. If you call me back next year, I might have one. Is knowing obsolete? Now you might say that's an awful thing to say. I mean, we'll lose all our pride in ourselves. We are called Homo sapiens, the ape that knows. How can you say is knowing obsolete? Well, that's a pessimistic way to look at it. There is an optimistic way to look at it too. Look at it this way. It took nature 100 million years to produce the ape that knows, Homo sapiens. And it took us, Homo sapiens, only 10,000 years to make knowing obsolete. What a fantastic achievement. Thank you. I'll leave you at that.
I'd like to ask whether you have, because we all know that there's a lot of information on the internet that anyone can put anything up there, so there's a lot to negotiate. I'd like to know, I'm just curious to know if you've observed children encountering discrepancies in information and whether you've observed how they go about doing that, or whether perhaps that is an important role of the teacher and how the teacher could go about doing that in the best way.
Okay, that's a very good question. And well, firstly, I have observed what happens. A couple of things about the internet. There are some misconceptions about, some people would say, oh, the internet is full of rubbish. Or the internet is full of wrong information. I'll ask you to try an experiment, which I try with my students very often. If I gave you 15 minutes, can you find me one? The internet is also a self-correcting mechanism. If you put something wrong into Wikipedia, it will disappear in a few minutes. Somebody somewhere will correct it. Okay? So that's point number one. But nevertheless, there are subjects where there are different points of view, and there you will get different points of view. A child alone can often make a mistake. But when you work in the self-organized learning environment, where they form groups and the groups can talk to each other, they never make a mistake. Never, ever. I'll give you a funny example from Durham County. In one of the really bad area schools, they were doing British history. So I made a question for them, which the teacher said is politically very incorrect. The question was, what was the British Raj? Was it good or was it bad? And British Raj, is the word for the British Empire in India. So the teacher said, are you sure you want to do this? I said, yeah, why not? I mean, it's a long time ago. So the children got to work on this. After a while, a group of girls in one corner said, Sugata, we've got the answer. So I said, yeah, what is it? So the British Raj is an Indian takeaway restaurant in South Shields. It's got its menu online and we're trying to check if it's good or bad. So there I'm standing there saying, my God, here I am going to watch my method go down the drain. But a group of really wicked little boys are in another corner, and one of them comes up to the girls and says, you stupid, it's not about restaurants, it's about India. And the whole system settles down and comes back on track. If you ever try it, you'll find that's how it works. It works through discussion. I've also heard, believe it or not, I've heard 10-year-olds say to each other, both of these web pages say the same thing. That one has more words in it, but this one is more accurate. It won't happen on day one, but as you do it with them over and over again, it will start to happen. And I do believe that these are the skills for this century that we need to teach, instead of teaching them 17 times tables. And then lastly, should the teacher help in this matter? I'm going to leave it to you. My first impression is don't move. Don't even get up. It's a very fragile method. I've seen a soul in action where the teacher just stands up and the children freeze. I've seen a soul in Australia where a teacher went up to a group of children and said, see what happens if you behave badly, you can't even do a Google search. And that was the end of the soul. Okay, just leave it to them. The first few will not produce excellent results. As they get used to it, as they realize that you're not going to help, they'll get better and better at it. Yes, please.
Do you think young learners' minds are becoming more hardwired so that they can use Google more naturally? And doesn't that have a drawback in terms of memory loss, or not being able to remember as well?
Well, that's an age-old question. I believe Plato asked once that writing is not a good invention because it will reduce human memory. We've always suspected, but the point is, what are you going to use that memory for if it can be done outside? Most of education until maybe just the last few years was because we had no storage except for the human brain. So everything had to be stored there in the hope that somewhere in your long life you will need it. But we have micro SD cards. We don't need that kind of education. What we need is the ability to know where to look for it, how to find it very quickly, and how to act on it. So I don't think memory gets increased or reduced if you practice it. I know that traditionalists will say that teaching multiplication tables improves memory. I'm not so sure. If that was so, then tribal children who don't go to school should have very poor memories compared to children who do. I have seen no evidence of it. In fact, they have far more sharper memories. They'll tell you where they saw a tiger pug mark 3 months ago. Exactly. So people remember what they need to remember. Yes, at the back over there.
First of all, thank you very much for a wonderfully refreshing take on education, and I speak as a teacher of 20 years. A lot of our schools, particularly in the international world, wealthy schools talk a lot about one-to-one laptops and tablets, and a lot of schools provide that for their students. So I'm very curious just to hear your thoughts of your sole method of doing everything as a group, as opposed to, should we be going that way and not going one-to-one technology?
Answer to that. If you can afford it, by all means give them one-to-one. But in the method that I'm proposing, where you are doing a self-organized learning session, you have to restrict the inputs or the resources given, because it's the group interaction which produces the learning. And you'll see a distinct difference. The ideal number seems to be 4 or 5 to one computer. The children these days when you first tell them, they'll ask you, why are you saying this? Why can't we all use our own computers? Well, tell them the story of the hole in the wall and say that we found it, that this is how it works. You try it and you tell me. After you do it a couple of times, then they realize what you're talking about. If they all have devices, then there is an advantage, which is what I would call anomalous increase in learning. Again, an example. In a class, I asked the children, do you want an easy question or a hard one? If they have to work alone, in the traditional format, they'll always say easy. If they have to do a soul, they always say, give us a really hard one. So I said, okay, I'll give you a really hard one. These were 8-year-olds. What is a fractal, and why is it important? Now again, this is postgraduate mathematics. So off they went working on fractals. They did what they did for souls are about 45 minutes long. And then it all finished, and they went away. But 2 or 3 days later, their teacher calls me up and says, Sugata, what exactly are you doing with the children? So I said, why? He said, because, in the playtime, they're sort of wandering around all over all the time, looking at trees and saying, see, that's a fractal. They're looking at flowers and saying, see, that's a fractal. They're looking at clouds and saying, see, that's a fractal. And yesterday, one of the children's mothers called up and said, what are they doing in mathematics? Because I had given my son a piece of pineapple to eat, and instead of eating it, he was staring at the skin and saying, Mom, the skin's a fractal. So then I thought, well, why is this happening day after day? And the answer was that they had laptops at home. So when they went back home, each child had continued. When they got back on the playground, they started discussing the websites that they had seen. So there may be an advantage where they each have access at home at least, or in school at other times, because then the learning doesn't stop with the soul, but seems to continue. If your question is exciting enough. Do I see your hand? Yes, please.
In fact, you are not as old as you think, because I remember a time which apparently you don't know, when there was a lot of popular science, even in Europe. People would rush to the astronomy club. They would read eagerly the books of Albert Einstein himself, popularizing without any mediation or communication agency his discoveries, and everybody would be very excited offering the books of George Gamow to their children. And today you have at CERN machines looking like cathedrals, and by the way, theoretical physicists parallel a standard model and quantum theory with mental cathedral, and still everybody is blasé, at least in wealthy countries, which in fact answers your question about is knowledge obsolete. In a way, most people today think that it's obsolete to waste time reading Einstein or even reading the Higgs boson results. Now, there is still one knowledge which you consider obsolete and which I do not, is about how a steam engine works. Because I attend as a journalist a lot of workshops on the green car and environmental, etc. And nobody, not even the best worldwide experts, remember the principle of thermodynamics. So they talk a lot, but when you ask them what is the average output of a modern engine as compared to the theoretical maximum input, they don't even know what you are talking about. So in my view, the steam engine should still be at the core of the primary school curriculum, but unfortunately it may work in India where you still have a yearly youth scientist competition, I think. I attended one in Goa 12 years ago. But in Europe and America, we are blasé, and what we want is just to know how to quickly buy shoes. We are not even able anymore to know how to where to put the umbrella. We need to hire a PhD laureate to do that for us.
Good point, but very coincident. You know, sometimes coincidences can be divine. I think we've got a divine coincidence here, because I did a session. Where did I do it? Somewhere in the south of England, in Cornwall, and I did the following. I took Google Earth and I zoomed in on Rome, and on another window I zoomed in on CERN. So we had these two windows, the Vatican and CERN. It's magnificent that you thought of the same example. So the children said, "What's that? What's that?" So I said, "That's St. Paul's Cathedral." "Oh, wow, just look at that. That's huge." And then I blew up CERN, which is about 20 times bigger. And they said, "What's that?" And I said, "That's our cathedral." So they said, "What does that mean?" I said, "You find out." The children asked the one question which children who do self-organizing systems ask. They said, "What's it called?" I said, "CERN." They said, "How do you spell it?" That's all you need to know. So I spelled it for them. 40 minutes later, they were talking about the Higgs boson. Okay, and they were talking about the Standard Model in their childish 9-year-old understanding. But why don't those science clubs work anymore? I have a theory. And I have a theory because I came into your culture from another one. When I first went to Newcastle, they told me, at 10 o'clock, around 9 o'clock or 10 o'clock at night, if you go out, don't talk to those adolescents who huddle around. They can be quite dangerous. So I immediately went out at 10 o'clock into the metro stop, approached the first group of purple, spiky-haired adolescents, and I said, I've just come from India and joined the university here, and I'm told that you are dangerous. Is this correct? So they started laughing, and they said, who told you that, sir? They were calling me sir. So I said, my colleagues at the university. So one of them says to me, them's dangerous. So then I asked them, wouldn't you like to, when you grow up, would you like to become a professor like me? And they started laughing. And they said, no, of course not. Why should I work so hard for so many years to become a professor like you when I can earn almost the same amount by being a bus driver? Then I realized what an ironic end to development. As you reduce the gap between the rich and the poor, the children stop aspiring. In India, no child wants to be a bus driver because an engineer earns 20 times as much. But you've reduced that gap. I don't know how you're going to solve it.
We like to talk about the 21st century as an age where everything's changing and education is becoming a different ball game. And that might be true, but let's not be in such a hurry that we forget those things that are eternal. Goodness, truth, discipline, the ability to listen to one another. These are the things that will never change, and we need to hold on to them.